Hello everyone. Before we start with today's true crime stories, please comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is currently. Also like the video, it really helps. Thank you. Let's get to it. The council worker lifted the manhole, expecting cooking fat. What slid into view was waxy, pale, threaded with hair, bone fragments. Someone whispered, "Human remains." Upstairs, in a quiet block at Muswell Hill, tenants had been complaining for weeks. The smell, the flies, the drains that gurgled at night. Police traced the blockage back along the stack to 23D Cranley Gardens. The door opened. A calm man, polite, put the kettle on. He nodded toward a plastic bag near the wardrobe. "It's a long story," he said. "To understand that confession, we need to go back, years earlier, at a different address." He came from the cold edges of the map, Fraserburgh, northeast Scotland, where the sea is a constant and childhood is shaped by absence. An unreliable father, a mother doing what she could, and a grandfather who became the steady figure in a shifting world. In hindsight, that layered bond, authority wrapped in tenderness, set a pattern. Depend on one anchor, fear its loss. As a teenager, he learned to be self-contained. He stood apart at school, quiet, rigorous, with a private interior life he did not share. Accounts later mention a fascination with death, with stillness, with the ritual around bodies. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual, but here, the silence started early, as a way of living. The psychology of the moment is important. If the living world feels unpredictable, the motionless body seems safe, certain, unable to walk away. He enlisted. The army offered structure, rules, clear ranks, and tasks that matched an orderly mind. He learned logistics, discipline, how to drink hard, and keep secrets harder. Inside barracks there were unspoken currents, homoerotic tension that could not be named without risk, camaraderie that blurred into longing, then pulled back by fear. He became good at compartmentalizing, duty here, desire there, doors that opened and closed with precision. After service, he drifted toward officialdom that promised identity and purpose. A brief stint with the police, then the benefits office. By day, forms, counters, queuing public, the hum of fluorescent lights. By night, a small rented room, and then a habit, the pub. In 1970s London, pubs were both sanctuary and hunting ground for men like him. Spaces where coded looks stood in for language and loneliness could be softened with alcohol and temporary company. He learned the tempos of the city's gay bar circuit at a time when shame and stigma still drove much of it underground. Men arrived already cautious, some already displaced. Runaways, drifters, labourers between jobs. He could read the room. He bought drinks. He listened. He offered what he himself needed: a place to stay, a bed, a sofa, tea in the morning. He carried himself like the perfect tenant, dependable, quiet, rent on time, radio low. Landlords liked him. Neighbours forgot him. That invisibility would matter later. In 1977 he moved to 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, a ground-floor flat with a small back garden, a domestic space to stabilise a life he could feel slipping between work and whiskey. He tried cohabitation in traditional terms, inviting men to move in, testing whether companionship could be negotiated into permanence. It could not. In a series of failed attempts, routine mutated into control. He rearranged the furniture, set rules, timed comings and goings, monitored moods like weather. When partners left, or never fully arrived, the fear returned, abandonment as a fixed star. Meanwhile, the dog entered his life, Bleep, one constant that greeted him and did not argue. He cared for the animal with uncomplicated tenderness. It is a detail that unsettles, because it shows he could attach with warmth, but selectively, within conditions he controlled. The contradiction is central. He craved connection, yet the terms of true intimacy, mutuality and unpredictability, scraped his nerves raw. Alcohol smoothed the edges. Weekend binges slid into weeknights. He learned that vulnerability clustered around closing time, last orders, last buses missed, cash gone, a couch offered. The plan seemed harmless, company without commitment, but there was a problem. The morning always came. People had lives to return to. They would stand, put on shoes, say thanks, and leave. Each departure became a rehearsal of the original wound. Get this, they actually thought the offer of safety ended at daylight. For him, daylight was the threat. He began narrating his need as a practical solution. If leaving causes pain, prevent the leaving. Control morphed from routine into strategy. He brought men back not only because he wanted them, but because he wanted them to stay, permanently. To understand why the boundary collapsed, consider the layout of Melrose Avenue. A relatively private, flat, floorboards that could be lifted, a garden with a shed and room for fires. Practicalities matter in crimes that depend on concealment. He noticed the logistics, even if he was not consciously planning the worst. He lived among tools that could later rationalize the unthinkable. At work, he was reliable. Colleagues describe him as competent, sometimes sardonic, never alarming. He kept to himself, shared a cigarette, discussed football, returned to his desk. The perfect tenant became the perfect colleague. There is a reason predators shelter in ordinary habits. They draw no heat. What stands out now in retrospect is that the contradictions held for years without exploding. The gentle caretaker of a dog, the neighbor who carried groceries for an elderly tenant, the man who lingered at bar closings, scanning for someone who would not be missed. The night it begins is not a cinematic thunderclap. It is December 1978, the season of parties and loneliness. A pub closes, a quiet boy cannot get home. An offer is made, a door opens, a kettle boils. He believes he has found a way to stop the leaving. He believes, briefly, the ache will end. But here is the twist. When intimacy and death collapse into one act, there is no way back. The perfect tenant steps over a line, and his home becomes a stage for erasure. Christmas week, 1978. North London is cold, breath fogs at the doorways. Pubs run on cheer and quiet desperation. Last orders ring, the lights lift. A teenager, Stephen Holmes, small, exhausted, cannot get home after drinking beyond his limit. He is not a troublemaker, not provoking anyone. He is just adrift at closing time, and that is when the offer lands. Come back, sleep it off. I have got a sofa, warmth, tea, a night's safety. It sounds like kindness, because, in shape, it is. They walk through the dark streets, two figures with nothing remarkable about them. Inside Melrose Avenue, the rituals begin, ordinary to the point of dull. Kettle on. Cigarettes. A record maybe. The dog settles. Stephen falls asleep. From the outside, this is a tired boy resting in a stranger's flat, planning to leave in the morning with a headache and a story about a near miss. Morning is the problem. He stirs, shoes near the chair. There is a pause, that small domestic moment when a host and a guest decide what comes next. For him, the psychology of the moment is important. Leaving equals loss, loss equals the old wound, and now he is the one who controls whether that wound opens. He moves with an eerie calm. A necktie or a ligature slipped from a drawer. He loops from behind, applies pressure, watches life ebb in silence. It is not rage. It is not impulse in the cinematic sense. It is deliberate, almost procedural. He later says he did not want Stephen to go. That phrasing matters. Want, not hate. Keep, not kill. The forensic reality, however, is stark. Stephen Holmes dies in a quiet flat, without a trace beyond fibers, fingerprints, and the killer's memory. Then comes the staging. He bathes the body, a domestic act recast as control. He speaks to him, seats him in a chair, plays at normality. The intimacy he could not tolerate while the boy breathed is reenacted on a body he can arrange. He lifts the floorboards. In a ground floor flat, they are practical, forgiving. He wraps the remains, slides them into the void below the living space. This act is quiet, methodical. There is no rush. He returns to life above, work at the office, football on television, trips to the shop. The arrangement becomes a secret architecture, a split-level existence. Upstairs, the person he shows the world. Below, the person he has chosen to keep. He returns to the body, again and again, in a trance of repetition. The language of control through stillness takes hold. He sits near the spot, drinks, talks. He feels less alone because the silence does not contradict him. What nobody knew at the time is that this contact created a template. Kill to stop leaving. Stage to simulate companionship. Store to maintain access. The 3 steps fuse into a single behavior loop. Meanwhile, ordinary life continues. He brings flowers for the mantle. He plays records. He feeds Bleep and laughs when the dog does something clumsy. The split feels functional, not deranged, inside his head. And yet, for all this, The practical problem remains. Floorboards cannot hold forever. Decomposition advances. Odors rise. He improvises. Later, dismemberment to slow decay, boiling of parts, small fires in the garden when the season allows. Each solution is a concession to reality, and each concession deepens the crime. Stakes are not abstract. Stephen Holmes had a family, a history, a path he did not get to finish. When he disappeared, the absence likely felt like teenage drift. Maybe he ran, maybe he was staying with friends, because stigma and uncertainty clouded missing persons reports for young men at the time. The erasure is efficient, because the victim's life sits at the intersection of vulnerability and police indifference, common in 1970s London. He tells himself a story to live with it. He is not a murderer. He is a companion to someone who needed him. That lie hardens into a worldview. It explains the ritual, the bathing, the conversations. It turns homicide into caretaking, a grotesque inversion. And because the story soothes him, hunger returns. Not sexual hunger alone, but the ache for a house that never says goodbye. There were no alarms the next week at Melrose Avenue. No neighbours banging on doors. No raids. The quiet became a witness. What stands out now in retrospect is that the lack of consequence did not shock him. It trained him. The house absorbed the act, the city shrugged, and the template felt reliable. Weeks pass, paychecks arrive. He goes to work, smiles at a colleague, signs, forms, with a steady hand. He drinks at the same pubs, notes the same patterns. When someone looks tired, when a wallet is thin, when the last bus has gone, he hears the same solution forming in his head. Keep them from leaving. It feels, to him, like mercy. It is, in fact, the beginning of routine. For a while, nothing changed on the surface. He still clocked in at the office, still drank at the same pubs, still walked home along streets that did not remember who had vanished the week before. But the house had learned a new rhythm, and so had he. By 1981, Melrose Avenue felt saturated, like a container filled to the brim. Unknown to them, across town, housing pressures and landlord disputes were pushing him toward a change. He did not know it yet, but the house that had been his private mortuary would force him out. He believed a move would reset the script, cleanse the risk, and give him new logistics to solve old needs. Instead, it created the flaw that would finally expose him. He left Melrose Avenue under pressure that looked ordinary on paper: landlord issues, neighbour complaints, the sense that the place had turned against him. Cranley Gardens offered a fourth-floor council flat. No garden, thin walls, a view of rooftops instead of a strip of grass where fires could burn unnoticed. He told himself the move would quiet suspicion. In reality, it removed the one disposal method that had kept his secrets contained. The new space was smaller, brighter, spare in a way that did not suit concealment. The kitchen was cramped, the bathroom narrow, the cupboard shallow. He stood inside it after moving boxes, testing the hinges, measuring with his eyes how much could be hidden and for how long. Without a yard, without floorboards he could easily lift, he turned to the flat's vanes, pipes, drains, a shared stack that threaded down through neighbours' ceilings into the soil below. He recognized the risk, but habit overruled caution. Companionship, in his mind, still meant control through stillness. His rituals followed him like luggage. He still hunted at closing time, scanning for the familiar signs: fatigue, distance from home, someone drifting on the margins. Back at Cranley Gardens, the sequence repeated with adjustments. A drink, a seat, a bath he framed as care, ligatures prepared in drawers that now felt too close to the front door. The dog settled quickly to new corners. The radio filled the rooms with a hum that tried to drown plumbing noises he did not want to hear. Early murders at Cranley Gardens echoed the established method. The difference was spatial. Dismemberment happened on a small kitchen floor, plastic sheeting spread, knives and a saw washed in a sink that fed the same pipes as everyone else's. He boiled parts in pots never meant for that task, steam-fogging windows that looked out onto a communal world. He bagged remains in plastic, stowed them in cupboards, under the sink, in a wardrobe whose door he closed with a careful push so it would not rebound. He experimented with disposal, the way someone experiments with recipes, making small changes, watching outcomes. He flushed tissue, poured greasy water down the drain, sent fragments into a system designed for soap and wastewater, nothing more. He believed, because he needed to, that the city could absorb anything. But here is the twist. The more he used the drains, the more the flat spoke back. His drinking deepened. The walls felt closer. He was aging into a middle manager's face. But inside, the ache did not mature. It sharpened. Nights blurred into mornings as he sat in a chair, talking to a body positioned opposite, believing the conversation stitched a wound closed. He would then turn, almost seamlessly, into a caretaker for himself. Clean mugs, washed floors, bleach poured until the air burned. Control existed everywhere, except in the pipes. Meanwhile, survivors who nearly died at Cranley Gardens would later describe the bath. He suggested it as a kindness, warm water, relaxation, a fresh start before sleep. Then the staging emerged, hands on a shoulder, a slip under the surface, a tightening at the neck. A few fought, a few blacked out and woke elsewhere, stunned by how close the room had come to being their last. They did not report it. They returned to lives that did not have space for courtroom battles or media glare, and the flat remained unchallenged. The disposal method became the weak point he could not patch. He tried to pre-dissolve tissue with hot water and chemicals, imagining he could reduce it to something unremarkable. He wrapped pieces tighter, flushed in smaller amounts, poured fatty stock from the pots at off hours, hoping the building slept when he needed it to. The drains began to gurgle, a wet throat clearing at night. He heard it and turned up the radio. Neighbour complaints shifted tone at Cranley Gardens. It was not the sweet-sour rot of Melrose Avenue's backyard anymore. It was a sewage smell, a blockage that returned after every fix. Tenants compared notes in stairwells, mentioned a film that clung to sinks, flies that appeared even in winter. He kept his politeness polished, carried groceries for someone on the third floor, nodded to the caretaker. The perfect tenant facade still worked, but less cleanly. Mechanical systems do not care about manners. What stands out now in retrospect is how the building itself narrowed his options, pressing his methods into a fragile routine. Without bonfires, he relied on concealment within inches of everyday life. Cupboards with plastic bags that brushed against coats, a kettle boiling next to a pot that should not exist. He was playing inches from discovery, and yet he kept going, because the psychological engine did not change. He needed bodies that did not leave. He developed tiny rules to relieve his anxiety. He flushed at staggered intervals, never twice in a row. He timed showers and disposal to overlap, a crude attempt to mask one flow with another. He opened windows during certain hours and shut them fast if footsteps paused outside. These rituals gave him the illusion of mastery over a system he was poisoning with every act. Meanwhile, below the floor he did not have, the stack collected what he fed it. Fat congealed, tissue lodged, bone fragments did not dissolve. The building's lower bends turned into traps, catching what he believed the city would carry away. Maintenance crews were called. The first visit was routine. The second, less so. The third bred suspicion. He heard the clank of rods in pipes and held his breath. By then, the flat's atmosphere had shifted into something unusual and unsettling. Bleach overlaid on decay. A cleanliness that read as overcompensation. He brewed tea for visitors, smiled, made small talk. A plastic bag by a wardrobe grew into a constant he could no longer wish away. The psychology of containment reached a limit. The system would not absorb what he kept feeding it. Everything was about to change when the drains finally spoke in a language even polite conversation could not drown out. The building demanded a story, and the pipes were ready to tell it. It started with a smell in the stairwell that sour-edged tenants could not place. Then sinks slowed, toilets coughed, and the whole stack began to gurgle like something alive. Complaints reached the council, and a maintenance crew arrived with rods, gloves, and the expectation of cooking fat. They lifted the manhole outside, slid the rod in, and felt resistance, greasy and granular. When the blockage broke, waxy lumps drifted to the surface, threaded with hair, flecked with something that looked like bone. Workmen glanced at each other. This did not look like a restaurant problem. They traced the line backwards, manhole to manhole, floor to floor, isolating the stack that served the top flats. It led, inevitably, to the fourth floor. Unknown to them, across town, he was at work, a normal Tuesday. By evening, the caretaker and a plumber stood in the stairwell, talking low. They would return in the morning with police. Someone in the building had been feeding the drains what the building could not take. Morning brought uniforms, calm voices, a knock at 23D. He opened the door in a sweater, polite, composed, the dog nosing at his leg. The room smelled of bleach, tea, and something that did not match either. He offered the officers a seat, offered to put the kettle on, kept his voice steady as they explained why they were there. A blockage, fatty deposits, bone-like fragments. Could they check his plumbing? He nodded. In the bathroom, the U-bends were too clean, as if scrubbed in anticipation. In the kitchen, the sink trap had been removed recently, then replaced. The officers looked at each other. They were not pathologists, but they could read a room. One asked gently if there was anything he wanted to tell them. He paused, eyes flicking to a wardrobe. Then came the line that shifted the air. There are remains in the cupboard. A plastic bag sat near the back, tied neatly. Inside, pieces wrapped in other bags, layered, labelled in his mind if not on paper. The room contracted into a single point. The admission, the bag, the quiet dog. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. He asked, almost conversationally, if they wanted to arrest him. They did. He put on a coat, patted the dog, and walked out past neighbours who had stood at peepholes and did not yet understand what they were seeing. At the station, the first interview set the tone. He spoke in full sentences, answered directly, and offered more detail than questions required. He described the drain disposal like a handyman lecturing on pipes, hot water, fat content, timing. Then he pivoted, almost clinically, to the killings, as if unloading a ledger he had kept internally. He did not frame it as violence. He framed it as companionship preserved. Detectives wrote fast, then slowed, trying not to push him into silence. How many? That was the question that bent the room. He did not give a clean number. Alcohol blurred his memories, he said. Faces without names, names without faces. Some at Melrose Avenue, some at Cranley Gardens. He mentioned the garden fires, the floorboards, the boiling. He mentioned the first one as the template, did not want him to leave. And then the repetition that followed. The psychology of the moment is important. He spoke like a man explaining a habit that had gotten out of hand, not like a man describing murder. They asked for names. He offered a few, partial, sometimes wrong, sometimes right. Stephen Holmes surfaced early, an anchor in a fog of others. A handful of survivors' details he did not know would surface later. Corroborating methods, rooms, the bath. Forensic teams went to Melrose Avenue with spades and sieves, to Cranley Gardens with wrenches and evidence bags. What he had called remains, the city now called homicide. Back at the flat, a full search began. Cupboards emptied into labelled trays, carpets pulled, baseboards pried, U-bends unscrewed and their contents poured into containers that would head to a lab. In the communal drains, crews worked carefully, collecting fragments that would later be catalogued by size, cut mark pattern, anatomical hint. Every piece carried a question. Whose? Every answer depended on a system that, at the time, struggled to connect missing men from the margins to bones with no identity. His confession style unnerved detectives because it was almost helpful. He corrected their timeline when they misplaced a season. He described a particular saw he favoured, the way certain joints gave less resistance, the boiling that reduced parts to something he thought drains could manage. He insisted he was not monstrous. He was lonely. He talked about talking to bodies, about bathing them, about seating them to watch television with him. He spoke of control, but used the language of care. Impact landed in two directions at once. Inside the interview room, the case shifted from a search for a single offender to an inventory of the erased. Outside, at both addresses, neighbours stared at news vans, tried to reconcile cups of sugar borrowed over years with the word remains. The perfect tenant had been a private mortuary manager, and the discovery turned erasure into evidence. The ledger of the dead began to take shape on paper. Columns of dates, places, fragments, and the few names they could verify. But confession is one thing. Proof is another. Detectives knew a jury would need more than his voice. They would need bones with cut marks that matched his tools, time windows nailed by survivors, drain contents that could be shown to be human, and not just any human, but the missing. The system, flawed as it was, began to build that bridge, piece by piece, from the pipes to the dock at the Old Bailey. Forensic teams stepped into two different worlds at once, a tidy fourth-floor flat with pipes that had become archives, and a former ground-floor home with a garden that hid a cemetery built from ash. The task was not just recovery, it was translation, turning fragments into people, and then turning people into names. At Melrose Avenue, they started with the soil. Grid by grid, they lifted turf, scraped layers, and sifted every shovelful through mesh screens. Bones surfaced in pieces, phalanges, vertebral arches, sections of long bones, stained by smoke, some calcined to a chalk hardness from repeated fires. Forensic anthropologists read cut marks like signatures. A hacksaw leaves straight, rough curves. A finer saw leaves tighter striations. Joints told their own story. Disarticulation at the natural seams, then separation where joints resisted. In hindsight, the patterns suggested practice, not improvisation. They mapped each find to a site plan, pinning flags, photographing angles, bagging with labels that fixed time and position. The analogy often used in labs is a jigsaw missing half the pieces, with the picture on the box torn away. Here, the pieces were not just missing, they were boiled, burned, and sometimes shattered. Still, certain elements refuse anonymity: dental morphology, healed fractures, distinctive vertebrae, the curvature of a clavicle. Every detail was a foothold. Cranley Gardens was different. Investigators opened U-bends, traps, and horizontal runs, pouring their contents into trays that turned water grey, then pink, then something that forced even veterans to steady themselves. Small bones, metacarpals, fragments of jaw, floated up with fat that had congealed into waxy discs. A pathologist examined tissue under a microscope, confirming human origin through cellular architecture, then narrowing to body region when possible. The plumbing itself became evidence: interior diameters, junction angles, because the physics of flow explained how fragments lodged and where they accumulated. Autopsies in the classic sense were limited. There were no intact bodies to lay on a table, no single cause of death to certify with a clean line. Instead, the forensic story relied on pattern, ligature marks implied by neck structures when present, but more often a convergence of context, confession details, survivors' testimony, and physical traces like fibers, consistent with ties found in his flat. The psychology of the moment is important here. The absence of whole bodies was not just concealment, it was control extended beyond death. Identification became the slowest, most punishing work. In the early 1980s, DNA profiling was not yet in service. The science that would later revolutionize cold cases was only beginning to stir in research labs. Detectives leaned on dental records when they had them, but many of the missing had never had comprehensive dental care. They leaned on families, when families existed, to describe scars, broken bones, or previous surgeries. They leaned on photographs. Ears are distinctive. So are teeth in smiles. Pathologists were often willing to say probable with care. Gaps in missing persons systems widened the gulf. Many victims came from the margins, estranged from family, transient, suspicious of authority. Police practices toward gay men at the time often produced humiliation, not help, so communities policed themselves quietly, and disappearances went unreported. This was not just erasure by a killer, it was erasure by a system that did not keep track of people it did not value equally. Investigators acknowledged, sometimes only in private, that names were missing because the state had never written them clearly in the first place. Survivors' accounts anchored the timelines. A man remembered a narrow bath and a hand on his chest as he slid under. Another described a cheap curtain pattern in a fourth-floor flat. One talked about the dog's steady gaze, a detail that sounds small but fixes a memory in place. These accounts, given years later, helped sequence the murders at both addresses, corroborating methods and seasons. They gave the bones a clock. Inside evidence rooms, photographs and sketches formed a wall of partial truths. A jaw fragment aligned with an old family portrait to produce a likely name. A healed ulnar fracture matched a childhood fall recounted by a sister. The puzzle never became complete, but it developed regions, clusters that could be associated with specific men with reasonable confidence. Families received phone calls that offered closure, filtered through uncertainty. The language was careful, likely, consistent with strong probability. Not everyone got even that. And then there were the uncounted. He admitted to a number that shifted at the edges, sometimes higher in tone than on paper, sometimes lower when pressed. Investigators considered a broader range based on fragments that could not be matched, on days unaccounted for, on items found in his possession that suggested presence, clothing, a bracelet, a set of keys with no lock to claim them. The accepted total sat uneasily next to the suspected higher tally, a reminder that a ledger built from pipes and ash will always have missing entries. Families coped in different ways. Some held memorials without remains, speaking a name into a space where a body should have been. Some visited Melrose Avenue's garden years later, standing on ground that had been sifted and reseeded, unsure whether the earth still held any trace. Some declined contact entirely, preferring absence to a narrative that would stain every memory. In the aftermath, closure was not a door shut, it was a window left ajar. Forensic reports, when read now, feel both clinical and haunted. Measurements, angles, saw mark counts, lists of recovered items. Yet between the lines, you can feel the effort to give back what had been taken, not just lives, but identities. Reconstructing the dead in this case meant reconstructing a social world that had allowed men to vanish without a trace, and then asking it to remember. With enough of the count established for court, the story moved from excavation to argument. Science could demonstrate human remains, methods of dismemberment, patterns consistent with homicide. Identification, even partial, tied those patterns to real people. The next step would not ask why bones looked a certain way. It would ask what the law should do with a man who insisted he killed to keep from being abandoned. In interviews, he returned to one phrase like a metronome. He did not want them to leave. Detectives heard it enough to recognize it as motive, not metaphor. For him, abandonment was not an event. It was a state that shadowed the room. The psychology of the moment is important. When goodbye felt like annihilation, stopping goodbye felt like survival. The method, strangulation, bathing, seating, was not improvisation. It was a script built to freeze time. He reframed murder as retention. He said he kept them. That word matters. Keeping suggests stewardship, ownership, a caretaking that erases the other person's will. In his telling, death became an administrative act, like pausing a conversation that could restart at any hour. He narrated the scene in domestic terms: tea, a bath, a chair by the window. He talked to bodies as if the voice could move backward through what he had done and restore presence. The delusion gave him comfort. It also gave him control. Psychologists who examined him noted narcissistic traits, self-focused narratives, sensitivity to slight, a need to regulate others, to regulate himself. Depersonalization appeared in his language. He slid into passive constructions that removed agency, as if events simply unfolded, and he happened to be in the room. Alcohol dependence dulled guilt and sharpened routine. He was not psychotic in the legal sense. He knew right from wrong. He planned, concealed, and adjusted. No insanity verdict would fit a pattern so calculated. What stands out now in retrospect is that he built intimacy by removing its core requirement, consent. He preferred the quiet of stillness to the challenge of reciprocity. He bathed bodies, arranging arms gently, speaking softly, not out of kindness, but to maintain the illusion of a domestic life that did not argue. Staging, in his hands, was not post-crime camouflage. It was the crime's continuation, an extension of domination into the hours and days after death. He chose men the system would not protect. That choice was not incidental. It was strategic. If no one searched, he could maintain the fantasy that he had solved abandonment. The invisibility of his victims co-signed the illusion. He cast himself as the only witness to their existence, then used that status to erase them further. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, silence was engineered. Investigators considered whether early trauma set the axis for his later control. A rigid, adored grandfather, then loss. A father absent. A boy who learned to retreat into an inner room where complicated feelings could be kept still. In the army, compartmentalization became skill. At Melrose and Cranley, it became pathology. He opened one mental locker to host a colleague, another to kill, another to cook dinner, and believed each could stay sealed from the others. There is a clinical analogy worth holding. Like a technician calibrating a machine to stabilize a fluctuating signal, he calibrated scenes to stabilize emotion. When anxiety spiked, someone standing to leave, he dialed the system to zero movement. Strangulation was not an explosion. It was a setting. Afterward, he tuned the room, washing, seating, speaking, until internal noise fell. It worked for him until the drains began to speak. He minimized violence in his own narrative. He described pressure on a neck as if it were a sedative, a gentle solution to panic. He cast drowning as a quieting, not a killing. He insisted he did not hate. He feared. The psychology does not excuse the acts. It explains their repetition. Fear of abandonment transformed into a policy. Nobody leaves. Policy demanded procedure. Procedure demanded tools, timings, and a room arranged for certainty. He also craved audience, on his terms. He kept souvenirs at times, not as trophies to relive triumph, but as anchors to sustain the story that they were still with him. He sat in a chair he had assigned to someone who could no longer sit and felt accompanied. He played music and decided silence meant agreement. Control reached its most chilling form in that misread quiet. Experts who met him saw intelligence, a capacity for reflection that made his rationalizations more unsettling. He could analyze his own behavior, then pivot to justification with a small shrug, as if insight were a postcard, not a map. He could locate the moment a guest stood to put on shoes, and identify it as the ignition point, then deny that any alternative existed, as if the only way to keep a person near was to erase their ability to move. The dog, Bleep, complicates the profile. He cared attentively, showed consistent warmth, protected the animal's comfort. He understood attachment, but within a relationship where one side had no say, that is the through line. He was comfortable when the other could not resist. Bodies after death, a dependent pet, neighbors who mistook politeness for harmlessness. Every relationship was curated to limit surprise. In hindsight, his language reveals the architecture. He did not say, "I killed him." He preferred, "He stayed," or "I kept him," slipping agency into a passive shell. He did not say, "I disposed of him." He said, "I removed the problem," turning a person into a variable. This diction is not cosmetic. It shows the internal filing system that made repetition possible. People were entries. Leaving was an error state. Control was the fix. Ethically, there is a trap in exploring motive here, turning a serial offender into a tragic figure. That is not the point. The point is that motive, properly understood, tightens responsibility. He selected people least likely to be defended. He rehearsed methods until they became reflex. He polished the mask of the perfect tenant so he could keep doing it. He did not lose control. He accumulated it, piece by piece, until the building's plumbing broke the spell. Old Bailey, late 1983. A vaulted room where ritual meets scrutiny, where the calm man from Cranley Gardens would be pressed into categories the law understands. He had already spoken at length in interviews, but trials are not confessions, they are arguments. And here, the argument narrowed to intent. Prosecutors built a timeline like scaffolding. Melrose Avenue first, floorboards lifted by archaeologists, fire residues mapped, saw marks compared to his tools. Then Cranley Gardens, U-bends, fatty deposits, human tissue recovered from a stack that served only a few flats, his among them. They layered survivors' accounts that described the bath, the tightening hands, the blackout. They did not aim for spectacle. They aimed for deliberation. Ligatures prepared, bodies washed, parts boiled, fires masked with tires. Planning, not panic. What did they want the jury to hear in that list? Control. Each stage, luring, strangulation, staging, dismemberment, disposal, was an act of decision. If murder is intent plus action, the state offered a sequence where intent renewed itself at every step. This was not a single loss of control. It was a system. But here is the twist. The defense conceded the acts, then asked the jury to consider responsibility through a different lens. Diminished responsibility, not insanity. Experts described a man driven by an overwhelming fear of abandonment, blunted by alcohol, sliding into depersonalization when intimacy threatened to end. They did not claim he heard voices. They claimed his mind, under strain, converted goodbye into annihilation, and annihilation demanded a drastic, pathological response. Psychiatrists for both sides agreed on certain traits, narcissistic features, dependency needs, alcohol dependence, but diverged on consequence. For the defense, these traits reduced culpability. For the prosecution, they explained method without excusing it. The psychology of the moment is important. Was he compelled, or did he choose a familiar relief and dress it as compulsion? Key witnesses anchored theory to rooms. A survivor described coming to in a bath, water in his lungs, a host apologizing in a flat monotone. A neighbor from Melrose Avenue recalled black smoke and the smell that was not rubbish. A constable recounted the line at 23D. There are remains in the cupboard, and the calm that followed. What stands out in court is how plain detail cuts through argument. The dog's name, a curtain pattern, a saw left to dry on a draining board. Ordinary nouns carried weight. Jury instructions translated psychiatric nuance into legal thresholds. Murder required intent to kill or cause grievous harm. Manslaughter by diminished responsibility required a recognized mental abnormality that substantially impaired his ability to form rational judgment or exercise self-control, providing an explanation for the acts. Substantially impaired is a careful phrase. Not any impairment qualifies, and not every compulsion removes choice. Counsel for the Crown emphasized foresight. He timed disposal at night. He bought pots large enough for reduction. He moved residences and adapted method. He spoke to detectives lucidly about tool choice and flow rates in drains. These are not the footprints of an unknowing sleepwalker. They are the notes of a manager. The defense returned to the same hinge. Standing to leave was the fuse, and in that moment, he could not bear it. The law does not punish feelings. The Crown replied, it punishes what you do with them. Verdict day came with a hush. Jurors filed in, faces shut, guilty of multiple counts of murder, life sentences, with a high minimum term. The legal system had chosen intent over impairment, finding that whatever his wounds, he acted with deliberation that met the highest threshold of criminal responsibility. Outside, cameras framed the stone facade, giving shape to a public feeling that had been building since the drains spoke. Fear, anger, a moral panic that attached itself to the phrase "killer next door." In newspapers, his politeness was recast as menace, his dog as a dissonant footnote, his flats as stages of erasure. The city asked itself how a man could boil bodies across a shared wall and still borrow sugar. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. After the verdict, the prison would hold him, but the story would linger in the gaps the system had not closed. Prison did not stop his need to orchestrate, it just changed the stage. He entered the system as a high-risk, high-profile prisoner, initially at Wormwood Scrubs, then moved through secure units where routine was absolute and privacy was rationed. He adapted quickly to the regiment, roll calls, searches, set meal times, because structure had always suited him. What changed was the audience. He wrote notebooks filled with recollections, theories about his own behavior, grievances about prison life, and scripts that recast him as a thoughtful analyst of a life gone wrong. He titled drafts with a bureaucrat's neatness, catalogued chapters, and tried to place the narrative under his control again. Some pages read like confession, others like justification. Transfers marked the years. A stint at Parkhurst, time at Wakefield, then shifts, as the system balanced security with the risk of notoriety. He kept routines, exercised at predictable hours, read widely, wrote letters with a careful hand. In a closed world, small power struggles carry weight. He understood that and operated within it. He fixated on rights, access to property, access to materials, access to correspondence. Legal battles became his new theatre. He filed for judicial review more than once, arguing that authorities were unlawfully interfering with his ability to document his life. Each hearing extended the performance. Throughout, he returned to the idea that he was not monstrous. He was lonely. The refrain reappeared in interviews, in notes sent to journalists, in drafts that circulated in limited form. The psychology of the moment is important. His self-understanding never escaped the gravitational pull of control, dressed as care. In 2018, after decades inside, he died in custody following complications from abdominal surgery. There was no public funeral. The state closed the file on his living presence, but not on his use as a case study. We end where we began, with quiet normalization masking violence. A flat that looked ordinary, a tenant who paid on time, a building that only spoke when the plumbing failed. The danger was not the monstrous mask, it was the ordinary one. Let's get to the second story. Shovels pause. An investigator lifts a scorched fragment, holds it to the light, and whispers, "Another." The pit behind the pool house gives back bones in handfuls, charred and brittle. A plastic tarp fills with teeth, vertebrae, a jaw hinge. Nobody talks above a murmur. One name moves along the line. Herb Baumeister, suburban entrepreneur, father, a man whose storefront smiled at the neighborhood. How many are here? How long has the ground been keeping secrets? The house stares down at them, windows black. To understand why the soil reads like a ledger, we need to go back. Westfield, Indiana, at the edge of Indianapolis, looked orderly. Fresh pavement, clipped hedges, horses beyond wooden fences. Status meant acreage and quiet. In that landscape, Herb Baumeister built an image that worked. He wore tidy polo shirts, kept a firm handshake, praised his kids' school events, and drove a practical car to a thriving resale chain. The stores had upbeat signage, donated inventory, and a feel-good mission that let customers believe in him, but the childhood stories are unsettling. Teachers remembered a boy who drifted from groups, studied faces rather than books, and sometimes laughed at the wrong moments. Classmates recalled a dead bird placed on a desk, not as a prank, more like a presentation. He wanted to see reactions, catalogue them. He learned early that attention had rules, that adults rewarded polish. As an adult, the facade tightened. He married Julie. They had 3 children. The address, Fox Hollow Farm, announced that they had arrived. Tall timber, a long driveway, an indoor pool room that made neighbors whisper about success. In photographs, Herb stood a half step forward, chin raised, the practiced smile of a man who believed he had solved life's puzzle. Own the store, own the house, own the narrative. There were cracks. He was treated at times for depression, described by those close to him as volatile, bright charm that turned ice cold with little warning. He micromanaged the stores, counted receipts late, and berated staff over tiny errors. At home, he restricted access, kept locks on interior doors, and treated the pool room like a sealed exhibit. The mannequins would come later, but the impulse to curate space was already there. The psychology of the moment is important. In a conservative suburb during the late 1980s and early 1990s, conformity insulated you. A man with a wife, children, and a business could drift through checkpoints that would stop someone else. Herb understood that. He wore normalcy like a uniform, then used it to move through the city at night. Meanwhile, something else was happening after dark. He slipped from the role, husband, father, employer, and drove into Indianapolis toward a nightlife that lived in the margins. He told no one. He did not need to. The mask held at home and at work. The second life began where the music was loud, where names were first names only, where a stranger's smile promised escape. From a distance, nothing looked wrong. Up close, control was the point. Indianapolis nightlife in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a map of unwritten rules. Back rooms, side doors, DJ booths with long shadows, and a set of bars where regulars watched out for each other because, at the time, calling the police was not a reliable option. Discretion was not just a preference, it was survival. You went where someone knew your face, where the bartender poured heavy and the door guy learned your name. Into that scene, a man appeared who did not fit the stereotype of danger. Well-groomed, quiet, generous with drinks, insisting on driving others home to save the cab fare. He introduced himself as Brian Smart. The name travelled easily. He listened more than he spoke. He complimented clothes. He admired muscle tone with the detachment of a coach. He did not brag. He let people project safety onto him because safety was the currency. Witnesses remembered the pattern. He would arrive alone, linger near the edge of the dance floor, and make conversation where the lighting softened faces. He bought a round, laughed lightly, and said he had a house with a pool outside the city, quiet and private, where they could keep the party going. He offered control by implying he already had it. A car, property, a key to the night continuing. The psychology of the moment is important. For men who felt watched or judged in public, the offer of a private space sounded like respect, a place where you were not a spectacle, and the suburbs promised what clubs could not: quiet. In hindsight, that quiet was isolation, and isolation was leverage. The drive out felt like a lullaby. 2-lane roads, trees closing in, the glow of a house beyond a fence line. Inside, he played host. He poured drinks, turned on music, showed off the pool room. The mannequins by the water, posed as if mid-conversation, were unusual and unsettling, but he disarmed questions with a shrug. Visual merch for the stores, he would say, or a joke about needing an audience. He framed the oddities as quirks, not warnings. Then came the games. He introduced breath play, what he called a consensual rush, a way to heighten sensation. He described it like a trick, harmless if you knew what you were doing. He would demonstrate a technique, fingers placed just so, a belt looped for leverage, promising he would let go when you tapped. It sounded clinical, like a lesson. He calibrated trust with the tone of a teacher. A few men went once and did not return. Others told friends afterward that it got too intense, that he pushed too far, that he did not seem to feel fear when they did. But in a world that already demanded secrecy, too far often stayed between two people. A missing night could be chalked up to a fling. And in missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Calls stop. Work is missed. A roommate files a report. The first response, often, is to assume travel, a move, or personal choice. Police blind spots mattered. Several missing men had been seen last at the same cluster of bars. Their ages lined up, their patterns, late nights, similar build, should have suggested a predator. But tips were siloed by jurisdiction, and cultural bias allowed a dangerous assumption. Young men leave. Many families heard the same advice: wait a few days, he will turn up, while the window for intervention closed. Meanwhile, witnesses described the same man and the same car. The side stories matched, a patchwork that was not stitched together until later. He used politeness as a lubricant. He made a private pool sound like a sanctuary. He referenced a landscaping job to explain grass stains, a long commute to excuse odd hours. What nobody knew at the time was how practiced the staging had become. The pool room's surfaces wiped down, towels laundered, liquor bottles lined up like props. The mannequins were not just decor, they were stand-ins for control. He invited men into a scene he had rehearsed, down to which light switches he flipped and where he set the ashtray. A mounting list of missing names collected at desks across the city: brothers, sons, friends, disappearing without a trace. Flyers curled on corkboards, photos faded in windows. Patrons swapped warnings in whispers that did not reach precincts in a way the system could absorb. The plan seemed perfect, but he overlooked one thing: survivors talk, and patterns, once named, do not disappear. And then there was the ride he offered to one man who noticed something off. The way the host's eyes brightened at the moment a guest lost breath, the lack of panic when a body went limp, the delayed release, like a decision rather than a reflex. That detail would matter. It would puncture the mask he had worked so hard to polish. One survivor's account would push the club's rumors into a case file. The pool, the mannequins, the belt, each detail specific enough to locate a house that did not want to be found. For now, the bars kept humming, and the man with the easy smile stayed in orbit, shopping for trust in rooms built for escape. He called himself Tony. Some reports use another name, but the details line up. A late summer night, the same bars, the same soft-voiced man who introduced himself as Brian Smart. They talked about working out, about jobs that required discipline, about how the city could feel small and predatory. Tony watched how Brian measured the room, taking in exits, mirrors, the dance floor's edges. Then came the offer: a quiet pool, drinks, a chance to keep talking where nobody listened through thin walls. Tony hesitated, then agreed. The car ride out dissolved the noise into trees and darkness. The driveway curved long, and the house opened like a showroom. Tony clocked the pool first, then something else: mannequins. Not one, not two, a cluster arranged as if a party never ended, frozen in half greeting, torsos in bathing suits, glass eyes staring past them. It looked like staging, an audience that would not object. The bar was stocked with good liquor, bottles squared to the edge, music soft, chlorine heavy in the air. Brian poured drinks and steered the conversation toward thrill, toward the rush of restraint. He framed it clinically: controlled strangulation, mutual trust, the tap-out signal, a safe, intense way to push limits. Tony listened. He had heard of it, but the way Brian described the mechanics: thumb pressure on the carotid, knees braced, belt positioned for torque, sounded rehearsed, not exploratory, practiced. The psychology of the moment is important. Tony was not naive. He had survived enough to recognize when a person's eyes brighten at the thought of control, when someone's curiosity is more about endings than experiences. Still, he let the scene play forward, maybe to test it, maybe to confirm a suspicion. Brian suggested the belt. He smiled, casual. Tony said, "Your turn first." Brian did not like that. He made a joke, deflected, said he preferred to guide. Tony held the line. "Teach me," he said. "Show me by letting me do it to you." A long beat, then Brian relented, stretched out, coached the placement, and insisted on the tap. When Tony tightened, he watched. At the edge of consciousness, Brian's face lit, a glimmer that was not fear. Tony released quickly. That was enough. He had seen the excitement point. He knew the danger zone. Then the switch. Brian's turn. The belt came up smooth. The angle changed. Tony's arms pinned. The pressure spiked fast, not the slow build he had insisted on earlier. Tony tapped. No release. He thrashed and caught a lamp with his shoulder. Light shattered, and instinct took over. He went slack, let his body drop like the fight had vanished. The pressure eased a fraction. He coughed, reached up, and scraped his nails hard along Brian's forearm, leaving a set of livid tracks. That stung. Ego cracked. The belt loosened. Tony rolled, stumbling to the pool's edge. Here is where the calculation saved him. He did not run. He laughed, placed a hand on Brian's chest, and said, "Too much too fast. I get it. Let's slow it down." He turned the apology into glue. Brian relaxed, the threat diffused by flattery. They dressed. Brian busied himself with the bottles and towels, wiping surfaces with an efficiency that did not match a casual hangout. Tony's mind filed every detail, the path from the kitchen, the distinctive windows, the way the driveway met the road. On the ride back, Tony asked for a cigarette stop, anything that would expose a sign or landmark. They pulled into a gas station lot. Under the fluorescence, Tony saw the license plate, caught most of the sequence, and repeated it under his breath until it stuck. Back at the city, he got out, smiled, thanked him, and watched the car disappear into traffic. He walked straight to a friend and said, "If I do not answer tomorrow, call the police." The next step is where many stories stall, but Tony refused to let it die in rumor. He called detectives. He described the house, the pool, the mannequins, the route they took, the belt, the expression. He gave the plate numbers he had memorized, minus a digit he could not catch. The officer on the line took the report, but the case did not ignite. Other reports sat in other stacks. Names were not yet sharing databases, and the label "Consensual Game Gone Wrong" hovered in the margins, muddying urgency. Weeks passed. Tony kept calling. He drove the same roads, searching for that driveway, scanning subdivisions like a hunter who knew his prey was in the brush. One night he saw the car again near the bars. He tailed at a distance, called a detective from the moving street, and narrated turns while trying not to spook the driver. The call dropped. He lost him. The frustration was palpable, so close, then gone. In hindsight, those near misses proved the system's fragility. Finally, a match. The plate numbers, cross-referenced with a narrowing neighborhood pattern, pointed to a man named Herb Baumeister, a business owner with a large property north of the city. Investigators set up soft surveillance, a low-profile watch that built a picture of movements and habits. In that window, Tony agreed to view the suspect in public. The day he stood near an aisle and heard Herb speak, the voice sank the ID. The cadence, the chuckle, the precise, gentle tone, they were the same. But here is the twist. Even with a survivor, even with a car and a name, the house remained untouchable. The property was private. The alleged acts, framed as consensual by a practiced host, left no obvious evidence visible to neighbors. A judge wanted probable cause inside the home. Detectives argued imminent danger. The warrant stalled. Legal hurdles framed the grid. They needed a breach that would hold in court. So investigators asked for patience and precision. They pushed on missing persons lists, tried to connect faces to the property, built affidavits, and waited for one more anchor, something physical, something undeniable. Tony, for his part, had done what survivors rarely get to do. He named the stage, described the script, and identified the actor. The gate, however, still stood closed, and behind it, the mannequins waited by the water like an audience for a show that would not stop. From Julie's perspective, Fox Hollow Farm was supposed to be a fresh chapter, acreage for the kids, space for the dogs, and a home office that kept Herb close. Early on, she noticed how he curated rooms, almost like museum exhibits. Certain doors stayed locked. The pool house became his territory. If she asked to host a party there, he stalled, citing repairs, chemicals, liability, control, disguised as caretaking. The moods were difficult to predict. He could be attentive with the children, then go silent for days inside himself. He would reappear with explanations, inventory crises, supplier disputes, a manager who needed discipline. He kept a ledger mind, tallying perceived slights. The smallest household disruption, a spilled drink on the carpet, could trigger a glare that lingered. Then, as quickly, the warmth returned, and he would bring home dinner for everyone, generous and apologetic without naming the offense. There were odors outside, especially near the back of the property where a fire pit sat beyond the tree line. He said it was brush. He said raccoons. He said anything that positioned the smell as rural life. When it drifted into the kitchen on summer nights, Julie closed the windows. Later she would learn what was burning. At the time, she accepted the story because the alternative was unthinkable, and because their life depended on the store's functioning and the mortgage being paid. The mannequins appeared by degrees. First, a few arrived under the pretext of visual merchandising. Then, they multiplied near the pool, fixed in social poses. Julie laughed it off to friends. Retailers are quirky, but the arrangement felt intentional, audience-like. Herb brushed off questions, insisting they helped him plan store layouts. She did not challenge him in front of the kids. She learned to choose the moments that would not escalate. Money tightened. The resale chain's margins were slim, and Herb hated scrutiny. He kept the books close, shooed Julie from the register, and handled deposits himself. When he vanished for a day or two, he would return sullen, then defensive. He said he needed space to think. She suspected a depressive cycle. She had seen it before. He refused therapy beyond sporadic visits, and medications changed without follow-through. The pool house turned off limits. He claimed he had found damage from kids' roughhousing, and he did not want liability if a neighbor wandered in. The lock clicked. At night, after the children slept, headlights sometimes cut across the back windows. Herb said a manager needed a late meeting. He would come home past midnight, damp towel over his shoulder, satisfied and calm. Julie drifted toward an uneasy truce with these explanations, reminding herself of the pressure he carried. Then came the small discoveries. One of the children found a bone near the fire pit and brought it to the kitchen, plunking it on the counter with the pride of a scavenger. Herb said it was a deer. He tossed it in a trash can and told them not to play in the woods. Another time, a dog dragged something pale from the brush. Herb scolded everyone for leaving scraps out. The kids learned to stop asking. The psychology of denial is not stupidity. It is survival. Julie had 3 children to protect, a husband who controlled the finances, and a property that isolated them from easy help. In that environment, suspicion comes in flashes, then gets folded into the next errand, the next school project, the next week. She did what many do. She established routine, waited for better proof, and tried to hold the family line. There were confrontations. She raised the late nights, the mannequins, the smells. He called her paranoid, accused her of not supporting the business. He flipped the narrative. She was the problem. Her questions were sabotage. When she pressed, he left for a drive. When she softened, he rewarded her with a plan, a vacation, a promise to slow down. The cycle kept them stuck. Herb's secrecy deepened. He brought home more locks. He stored barrels of something near the garage, labeled in his handwriting as cleaning supplies. He cautioned the kids to steer clear. Julie started documenting what she could, dates of the disappearing acts, odd receipts, notes about the smells and the fire pit. Quietly, she consulted an attorney, not to accuse yet, but to understand her position if she needed out. The tipping point came when the police, still blocked from the property by legal limits, asked whether she had seen anything unusual. She hesitated, then told them about the bones, the odors, the restricted areas, the mannequins. She admitted she feared the pool house. She understood, finally, that the stains on the deck did not look like rust. Fear for the children sharpened her choices. When Herb traveled with their son on a brief errand, leaving the house unguarded for once, she made a decision. She allowed investigators to step onto the property line, to look at the area by the fire pit. She did not grant a full search, but she opened a door that had been shut by intimidation and doubt. The soil would speak if they listened closely enough. The moment she let them in, the ground changed from private land to a witness. A single choice, a quiet yes on a summer afternoon, shifted the case from rumor to excavation. While she held the family together in the front rooms, detectives edged into the shadows out back, where the answers waited in fragments. While Herb was away, a detective knelt at the edge of the fire pit and sifted a handful of ash through his fingers. Something clicked against his wedding ring, a calcined chip, curved like part of a socket. No one spoke the word yet. They did not need to. A tarp appeared. Then another. Gloves snapped on, and a square of earth became a grid. Stakes marked boundaries. Twine stretched tight. They started with surface collection, eyes trained to distinguish shell from shard, slag from bone. Within minutes, they were filling specimen bags with fragments, porous cranial tables, phalange tips, beads of melted dental acrylic. The smell of old burn lingered, sweet and metallic. A forensic anthropologist arrived and called for sieves, 5mm mesh, to catch what the eye would miss. Stakes, why this moment matters. This was not just a backyard, it was a dump site transformed by fire, and if the fragments proved human, the entire case would shift from suspicion to homicide. Families needed names, detectives needed probable cause, and a community needed to know if a quiet estate hid a killing ground. Action. What happened? Crews set up triage. one table for potential human remains, one for animal, one for indeterminate. Each find got a bag, a label, a grid square, a photograph. The first clear human element was a mandible segment with a molar intact, enamel crazed by heat, then vertebral arches, thin and scalloped, consistent with adult human cervical bones. A belt buckle surfaced nearby, warped by heat, leather long gone. They extended the grid, moving outward from the pit into leaf litter, then to a drainage swale where heavier pieces might have rolled. The pace settled into a grim rhythm. Trowel, scrape, brush, pause, bag. What nobody knew at the time was that burning on open ground rarely consumes fully. It fractures. Bones calcine, turning white and brittle. Then they explode into chalk and shards. By late afternoon, they had counted dozens of fragments with human morphology. Night brought floodlights, and a quiet that made the clink of metal on stone too loud. Impact, how it changed everything. The scene transitioned from suspicion to confirmed human remains, unlocking the pathway to a broader search and, eventually, a warrant. It also reframed Fox Hollow not as a single-event crime scene, but as a repeated disposal site, implying a count that no one wanted to say aloud. The next day, they brought in sifters, tarps, and rakes, meant for wildfire recovery. Soil went onto the screens, rocked back and forth until bone glowed against dark earth. Teeth stood out, their shape unmistakable. Tooth enamel survives heat that destroys soft tissue. Crowns with fillings told investigators they were not looking at ancient remains. They were modern, adult, and from people who had seen dentists. Human versus animal demanded care. The anthropologist explained cortical thickness, the curve of human rib fragments versus deer, the telltale porous structure of pelvic cancellous bone. Burn patterns told another story. Some pieces showed pot lidding, a blistering from high heat. Others were soot black, suggesting differential burning, as if the fire had been fed inconsistently. Mixed in were melted aluminum cans, liquor bottle caps, and wire, household trash used as accelerant and cover. Stakes. Identification would be a war of inches. In the early 1990s, DNA testing existed but was not routinely applied to fragments this compromised. Without intact long bones or teeth with recoverable pulp, names could remain out of reach, leaving families trapped between hope and dread. Action. Detectives mapped burn sites across the yard. A second concentration appeared near a tree line where ash layers hinted at repeated fires. They widened the search to outbuildings and the creek bed. In the mud, they found clusters of small bones, phalanges and metatarsals, washed downslope by rain. The team established a temporary morgue area, cataloguing everything with chain of custody rigor. Meanwhile, the media gathered at the road. Cameras pointed at a driveway that no longer promised suburban safety. Neighbors stepped forward with memories of night fires and a smell they had dismissed as brush. Families of missing men arrived with photographs in plastic sleeves, asking about tattoos, dental work, a broken collarbone from years ago. Investigators took statements, gathered dental records, and compared antemortem charts to the recovered teeth. A match like that, if it came, would give one mother a name to bury. Impact. Confirmed identifications began trickling in, each one converting rumor to reality and expanding the potential victim set. The property became an anchor point for a regional pattern of disappearances, changing jurisdictional dynamics from competing to cooperative. It also hardened public perception that a respected businessman had been killing in plain sight. Meanwhile, investigators read the scene's psychology. Disposal on one's own land signals confidence and convenience. It reduces transport risk, keeps control within a perimeter, and turns routine, burn, crush, scatter into a ritual. The mannequins inside matched the staging outside, set pieces arranged to create an illusion of normalcy, while the real narrative unfolded where light did not reach. A complication surfaced. Many fragments were too small or too heat-damaged for DNA extraction with the era's methods. The team banked samples, anticipating future techniques. They prioritized teeth and any bone with preserved marrow cavities. Forensic dentists compared unique filling shapes, root patterns, and bite-wing radiographs. A single matched molar could carry an entire life's next chapter. Behind the caution tape, rumor churned. Counts were floated, then withdrawn. Investigators refused to speculate. They focused on what could be proven, a discipline that would prevent a defense from dismantling the case later. But here is the twist. With the prime suspect alive and unarrested, Every bag of fragments raised the stakes on surveillance and strategy. Would he return? Would he flee? In the middle of the second week, rain hit hard. The yard turned to slick clay, forcing a pause and threatening to wash micro-evidence downslope. Teams covered grids with plastic, weighted edges with cinder blocks, and worked under tents. In that pause, families waited in motel rooms, listening to weather reports like they were verdicts. When the clouds lifted, a breakthrough appeared. A cluster of teeth with distinctive dental work, a gold crown that matched a missing man's dental chart. Confirmation followed. A name returned to a set of remains. In the aftermath, the pit was not just a hole in the ground, it was a ledger of violence. Each fragment an entry, each tooth a signature. As detectives closed in, the yard kept giving up secrets, but a different clock was ticking. The window to confront the man whose land held these fragments was narrowing, and he could feel it. Word spread quietly that the yard had started speaking. Herb felt the air change around him. Phone calls clipped short, a new stillness when he walked into a room. He left the store abruptly, told an employee he needed time, and did not come home. He drifted first into cheap motels and back roads, the kind of liminal spaces where no one asks questions if you pay in cash and leave early. He made small, deliberate purchases: snack food, a road atlas, cartridges for a .357 revolver he already owned. At a gas station, he stared at a map rack longer than necessary, then bought Ontario. He drove north, skirting interstate rest stops for county pull-offs, choosing the kind of places where exhaust smells like wet pine. In hindsight, this was not improvisation. It was a controlled fade, the same instinct that kept his pool room sterile. At the border, he crossed into Canada with little friction. The car, practical and nondescript, blended into family vacation traffic. No warrants were active, only an intensifying interest back home, and he knew it. He pushed past Sarnia and followed signs toward Pinery Provincial Park, where sand dunes roll into Lake Huron and trails wind through oak savanna. Solitude came cheap there. A picnic area, a parking lot, the muted sound of water. He wrote a note on motel stationery, a tight block of script, blaming business pressures, marriage strain, the weight of expectations. There were no names of victims, no confession, nothing that acknowledged the bones lifted from his land. It was an erasure by design, an attempt to control the narrative one last time. The revolver lay on the passenger seat. He drove to a turnout lined with scrub, rolled down a window, and let the summer air in. The psychology of the moment is important. He had curated stages all his life: the store floor, the pool room, the yard, and this was a final set, sparse and efficient. He sat with the lake beyond trees he did not bother to admire, folded the note, and tucked it where someone would find it. Then he leaned back. A single shot. In an instant, the investigation lost its central witness and its only chance at a confession. Park staff found the car. Police found the body. The note read like an accounting memo, full of grievance and self-pity, empty of regret for anyone but himself. Back in Indiana, detectives tightened their circle around Fox Hollow, now unimpeded by a living suspect's legal maneuvers. The case pivoted from pursuit to reconstruction. Every fragment in evidence bags became the only testimony that would ever exist. Families absorbed the news with a mix of relief and rage. Relief that the threat was over. Rage that he had chosen silence over answers. No courtroom, no cross-examination, no sequence that explained how nights in a city ended in ash behind a suburban pool. Reporters swarmed the farm's gate. The mannequins inside the pool room stood in their frozen poses, indifferent to the storm outside. In the aftermath, the car in Ontario felt like a coda in a language he had spoken for years. Controlled, self-protective, cruelly incomplete. Investigators turned back to the ground. Without his voice, the earth would have to finish the story. Investigators built the victim profile from what families reported and what the ground surrendered. Young men, late teens to early 30s, many connected to the gay community in Indianapolis and surrounding cities. Some were transient, couch surfing, moving between jobs. Others were rooted, steady work, tight friend circles, predictable routines. A few had cars, many did not. That detail mattered because transportation was leverage, and leverage was his preferred tool. Shared vulnerabilities converged. In that era, distrust of police was rational. Harassment and dismissal were common. If a son missed a week of calls, families feared moral judgment before they would get practical help. Clubs functioned as refuges, but they also concentrated risk. He learned that the same closed loop that protected regulars also helped hide a pattern. If reports stayed inside the community and never crossed a desk, the trail stayed warm for him and cold for detectives. The approach was consistent. He presented as stable, older, employed. He claimed a home that sounded safer than a motel and a pool that sounded cleaner than a crowded apartment. He signaled he knew the culture, enough to blend, not enough to set off alarms. He avoided the loud arrogance that predators sometimes reveal when they think they own a room. He let others project trust onto the image he built. Modus operandi sharpened in interviews. He lured with rides, alcohol, and the promise of privacy. Once inside his controlled space, he steered sex towards strangulation, framing it as consensual breath play. The mechanics were precise: belts, ligatures, manual pressure, with a fixation on managing consciousness. Forensic reality later matched witness accounts. Strangulation marks do not always leave classic bruising when pressure is distributed and heat is introduced soon after. The burn sites erased much, but the pattern held. Trophy behavior versus efficiency stayed an open question. No reliable cache of keepsakes surfaced. No clear collection of IDs, jewelry, or clothing that could be tied to multiple victims. Instead, the scene read as practiced disposal: burn, crush, scatter, covering risk rather than savoring souvenirs. The mannequins by the pool suggested something closer to ritualized audience than trophy. If he collected anything, it may have been intangible, the memory of control, replayed. The count is where speculation tempts, but discipline matters. Confirmed victims tied to the property were limited by identification methods of the time. Other disappearances fit the pattern geographically and temporally, yet could not be proven. Investigators considered a cluster along the I-70 corridor and state lines, but evidence did not meet the bar for definitive linkage. The responsible posture was to keep the aperture wide, while naming only what the fragments and records could support. Families described sudden erasure. Calls that always came on Sundays stopped. Paychecks went unclaimed. Apartments sat neat, as if the occupant had stepped out for a drink and never returned. One mother saved message tapes she replayed so often the ribbon warped. A brother kept paying a shared gym membership for months, unwilling to cancel the last place they had lifted together. These small habits mapped the cruelty of the pattern. Livs interrupted mid-sentence. Why did it work? He exploited gaps, social stigma that muted alarm, jurisdictional silos that slowed pattern recognition, and the inherent privacy of adult nightlife. He also exploited the psychology of courtesy. He looked like someone who would help you avoid a long walk, who would pour a drink that was not watered down, who would offer a ride home rather than watch you flag a cab in the rain. Courtesy became camouflage. What stands out now in retrospect is adaptability. After the survivor escaped, he refined control, fewer risks, tighter cleanup, more isolation. He learned to keep his name variable: Brian in the city, Herb in the suburbs. He stopped leaving witnesses who could describe the pool room's choreography. He likely adjusted which bars he visited, lengthening intervals between outings to avoid creating a timetable detectives could sit on. The demographics were not just statistics. They were pressure points in a culture that, at the time, did not treat gay men's disappearances with equal urgency. When police forms coded someone as voluntary missing, families entered a slow, grinding purgatory. Some kept calling detectives, some canvassed neighborhoods, some stapled flyers until their fingers bled. The system caught up, but late, and his pattern lived in that delay. In the aftermath, victimology served two purposes. It honored the men as people, sons, brothers, co-workers, friends, whose routines and choices should not have made them targets. And it became a case-building tool that tightened the timeline, focused outreach to potential witnesses, and established that what happened at Fox Hollow was not an accident or a one-off gone wrong, but a sustained method. From the first disappearances to the tarps at Fox Hollow, the case lived inside filing cabinets that did not speak to each other. Reports sat in city precincts, county sheriff offices, and suburban departments that shared borders but not databases. A bartender told one officer about a regular who vanished. A mother told another about a son who did not miss Sunday calls. The details rhymed, but the pages never met. Stakes. Why does this matter? Because a predator moving between nightlife districts and county lines thrives on bureaucratic silence. Every day a file waits on a desk. The trail cools, alibis harden, and families lose leverage to demand action. Action. Early on, missing adults, especially gay men, were often coded as voluntary. Officers, working heavy caseloads and short resources, asked the standard questions. Any fights at home? Any drug use? Any reason he might need a break? The answers, filtered through stigma, became conclusions. He will turn up. That sentence shut down urgency. Meanwhile, tips naming a soft-spoken man with a nice car drifted in, but without a shared system, patterns stayed invisible. One detective built a hand-drawn map, pins for last known locations, string for bar clusters. Another kept a running list of license plate partials. None of it connected until the survivor's account forced a reread. Even then, probable cause rules boxed them in. A judge needed something concrete from the property, not the city. Without a warrant, the house stood like a fortress secured by legal language. But here is the twist. The first time Tony gave his plate partial, an operator miskeyed one digit. The return went nowhere. Weeks were lost. When the error surfaced, the correct record pointed straight at Fox Hollow. In hindsight, that small clerical miss explains how fragile progress was. One wrong number, and you are back at zero. Impact. Once bones surfaced, the jurisdictional posture flipped from siloed to collaborative. City homicide, county detectives, state police, and the coroner's office formed a task rhythm. Briefings at dawn, assignments by grid, evidence control centralized. Prosecutors sat in, shaping affidavits to withstand defense scrutiny. The survivor's ID, once a lone voice, became a keystone inside a growing structure. Stakes. Could coordination have come sooner? Families asked it outright. Some filed complaints about indifferent responses. Others confronted watch commanders with timelines and phone logs. A few community advocates, used to bridging gaps with their own phone trees, pressed for a liaison officer trained to handle LGBTQ+ cases without bias. Their pressure mattered. Action. Interagency meetings standardized questions for new missing adult reports, last seen location, known companions, bar names, vehicles, any mention of a pool or a house outside the loop. Flyers began featuring composite behaviors instead of a suspect sketch, offers rides, references a private pool, uses the name Brian. Detectives swept dumpsters near nightlife corridors for discarded belts or towels, anything linking city nights to a suburban stage. But inertia is powerful. A patrol shift can change, a detective can rotate, and a case can lose its champion. What stood up against that churn was documentation, chronologies that survived personnel moves, evidence logs that could be read by any newcomer without losing nuance. In the Fox Hollow investigation, chain of custody rigor did not just protect prosecutions, it protected continuity. Impact. The missed chances became lessons. Centralized missing persons intake, cross-county data sharing, early elevation of patterns that affect marginalized groups. Departments instituted policies to prevent voluntary missing from becoming a default when evidence suggested risk. Some named LGBTQ+ liaison roles to rebuild trust and expedite credible tips from communities that had been dismissed. The psychology of the system is important. Institutions, like people, protect their self-image. Admitting blind spots felt like an indictment, but it became a turning point. Briefings began with what they did not know, not a defense of what they had tried. That shift allowed a late but real acceleration. And yet, for all this, the cost remained. Parents who had reported early, partners who had begged for welfare checks, friends who had copied plate numbers on napkins, they lived with the knowledge that a faster response might have changed an outcome. In the aftermath, detectives carried that weight too. They visited families, explained the new protocols, and, in some cases, apologized. What stands out now in retrospect is that the same suburban quiet that shielded Fox Hollow also muffled alarm across agencies. After the excavation, the quiet broke. Phones were linked, reports mirrored across systems, and when a new tip named a house with mannequins by a pool, it no longer landed in a single inbox. It triggered a network that will not return the missing, but it narrowed the space where a predator can hide. To read Herb's behavior, you start with control. Not anger, not impulse. Control. He engineered environments, curated rooms, and rehearsed routines that turned chaotic human contact into scripted scenes. Clinical profiles later pointed to antisocial traits, narcissism, and a strain of sadism, the blend where empathy is absent, self-image is fragile, and pleasure comes from managing another person's breath, heartbeat, and fear. The psychology of the moment is important. He did not chase violence for noise. He chased it for order, for the quiet that follows when a body stops resisting. Masking came early. As a child, he learned which expressions earned approval, which mannerisms bought him space. As an adult, masking became a full-time job. Marriage, children, a business with upbeat signage, all functioning as costume. The mask was not accidental polish, it was armor. He wore helpful neighbor and civic-minded owner like uniforms, absorbing credibility that he could spend at night without suspicion. When you heard him speak, the cadence was low, deferential, almost apologetic. That tone greased the hinge between two worlds. What stands out now in retrospect is how the house amplified the mind. Fox Hollow was a co-conspirator, not a backdrop. Long drive, tall trees, a pool room sealed from casual visitors. It offered the illusion of a normal family estate, while insulating a private theater. Isolation reduced witnesses, increased cleanup control, and fed the delusion that he operated without risk. In that space, mannequins were not kitsch. They were proxies, silent onlookers, posed to transform human encounters into performances. He did not need a crowd, he needed the feeling of an audience. The mannequins themselves speak to motive. Were they surrogates replacing intimacy he could not manage, or were they an audience he could dominate? Investigators considered both. One analogy helps. A stage magician practicing a trick alone, repeating the mechanics until the reveal hits every time. The mannequins let him rehearse, refine lighting, sight lines, and the ergonomics of where a belt could be grabbed without fumbling. When a man stood where a mannequin had been, the choreography was already locked. Stressors did not create the predator, but they accelerated him. Business pressure tightened his need for control. Marital strain threatened the mask, forcing more rigid boundaries at home. Money problems frayed patience. In that compression, the hunt offered release, the one arena where outcomes felt certain. He selected targets from rooms where discretion was normal, so refusal could be reframed as preference, not danger. If a night went wrong, he rewrote it as a misunderstanding. If it went right, he burned the remains and reset the stage. He learned from near misses. After the survivor scraped his forearm and laughed off the escape, Herb adjusted. Fewer drinks that left people noisy, more drinks that left them compliant. Faster transitions from hospitality to restraint, tighter cleanup, more attention to towels, surfaces, and timing. He refined his pitch, calibrating charm to the person in front of him. If someone hesitated at the mannequins, he had a prepared line, store decor, a joke, a shrug. If someone asked to try breath play on him first, he resisted, deflected, or managed the experiment so it never compromised control again. Profiles labeled the trait constellation with clinical precision: lack of remorse, shallow affect, grandiose self-concept, sexualized aggression mediated by strangulation. But beyond labels, the pattern shows compulsion. He was not improvising each encounter, he was reenacting. The outcome was pre-decided, and the theatrics, the drive, the tour, the glass of liquor, were ritual steps that steadied him on the way there. Each successful act reinforced the next, narrowing his world until the only time he felt fully present was at the decision point between letting go and not. Masking also meant compartmentalization so rigid it looked contradictory. He could attend a child's event in the morning, correct a display at his store midday, and walk a man into the pool room at night without cognitive bleed. That split was not balance. It was detachment. He did not integrate guilt because guilt would fracture the mask. He stored scenes like files in separate drawers and opened only one at a time. When the drawers stuck, as when Julie questioned the smells, he became punitive or absent, resetting distance so the compartments never merged. Why the fixation on strangulation? Control over breath is intimate and godlike to a person who craves power. It requires proximity, technique, and sustained attention. It is also quiet, leaves fewer immediate marks, and can be framed as consensual within sexual context. The method suited his need for dominance and his talent for plausible deniability. In that space, he could claim an accident if confronted, and he could convince himself, if only briefly, that consent had covered intent. The house's layout contributed to psychological momentum. Narrow hallways forced single-file movement, keeping guests ahead of him. The pool room's smooth surfaces minimized trace. Lighting dimmed with a single switch, changing mood on command. doors locked from the inside with mechanisms he had practiced blind. Even the distance to the fire pit had logic, far enough to shroud smoke in tree cover, near enough to move quickly with a wheelbarrow or tarp. When you overlay the floor plan with his behavioral profile, you see a man designing for efficiency. The mask cracked only when he lost control, when someone did not react to coaching, when flattery stalled, when a lie met a direct, simple question. Then the eyes went cold. Witnesses recalled that shift, the absence of anger, the presence of calculation. He did not explode, he adjusted. If the variable could not be brought back under control, he ended the scene. Later, he fine-tuned the script so the variable never reappeared. Profilers debated whether the mannequins were mere staging or a deeper delusion. There is no evidence of psychosis. Instead, they likely were instruments, objects creating a perimeter of attention. He put himself center stage, surrounded by mute approval. That is narcissism's habitat. Every pose implied focus on him, every plastic gaze a guarantee that the audience would hold until he was finished. In hindsight, what kept him hidden so long was not genius, it was fit. His pathology fit the era's blind spots. He crafted a surface that institutions trusted, hunted in spaces those institutions underprotected, and used methods that blurred lines between consent and coercion, just enough to stall intervention. The compulsion to hunt thrived in that gap, and every risk that went unpunished trained him to believe the mask was permanent. But masks wear thin under heat. Finances tightened, family pressure rose, and the survivor's testimony pierced the performance. Control, once effortless, required more force. That is when compulsion becomes cornered instinct. He did not stop because he learned empathy. He stopped because discovery interrupted access. And when discovery closed in, he chose the one act that restored total control over the narrative. Silence, final, and absolute. In the months after the excavation, families lived between police briefings and quiet rooms where photographs leaned on mantles. Identification was slow, technical, and often inconclusive. Early DNA work struggled with heat-damaged fragments, so the first names returned through dental charts, distinctive crowns, and comparative radiographs. One by one, a few families got phone calls that began with a coroner's careful tone, a name attached to a tooth, a date for a burial, relief and devastation arriving in the same envelope. Years later, advances in DNA changed the arithmetic. Laboratories began extracting profiles from slivers once considered too compromised, using mitochondrial DNA where nuclear DNA had failed. Evidence that had been archived, bagged, and labeled was reopened, swabbed, and tested again. Matches emerged that gave families what they had waited for, a point of certainty to organize grief around. Some held memorials with a single urn containing a fragment, a symbol that stood in for a life that deserved a full story. Memorialization was quiet, not grand. Small services with friends who had kept the same numbers for decades, mothers who had saved birthday cards, brothers who had not cancelled gym memberships until the call came. Names were etched on headstones that looked ordinary on the surface but marked a history that had lived in whispers. The act of naming, of laying a marker in the ground, pushed back against erasure. Fox Hollow itself turned into a cipher the public could not let go of. New owners faced a burden they had not created. Curiosity seekers at the gate, cameras on the shoulder, and questions about strange sounds or shadows in windows. Paranormal claims surfaced, voices by the pool, cold spots in the hall, a sense of being watched near the tree line. Some visitors framed those stories as respect for the lost. Others turned them into spectacle. The line is thin. The house became a mirror for whatever a person brought to it: grief, fear, or thrill. Ethical questions followed. Should a property that held violence be rented, toured, or filmed? Where is the line between education and entertainment? Families answered by centering names, not the house. They spoke at community events about missing person protocols, about the danger of labeling adults as voluntary when evidence suggested risk. They advocated for LGBTQ+ liaison officers and pushed for reforms that would prevent another cluster of disappearances from being minimized. The psychology of the aftermath is important. Survivors of the victims' families lived with the daily negotiations of memory. How much to share with a younger sibling who did not understand the era's stigma. How to correct a news report that flattened a life to a single night. How to carry the ordinary, laundry, rent, birthdays, while holding a story that was anything but ordinary. Advocacy gave some of them structure. They became experts in paperwork and policy, a defense against the helplessness that had defined the early years. Meanwhile, Fox Hollow's shadow stretched across true crime culture. Documentaries, podcasts, and late-night interviews returned to the same images. The pool, the mannequins, the tarps in the yard. The most careful productions put families at the center, acknowledging that the case is not a puzzle to solve, but a ledger of harm to witness. Others drifted toward haunted house myth. The distinction matters. A house does not haunt, the silence does. What stands out now, in retrospect, is how the ground's evidence forced institutions to evolve, and how families translated private grief into public change. The property became quiet again, grass grew over grids, but the names, once confirmed, did not fade. They anchored a new set of practices that treat disappearance as danger until proven otherwise, especially for communities that systems had ignored. Let's get to story number 2. Sirens slice through damp coastal air. Another body, then another, found near Santa Cruz, the city feeling the ground beneath it, unreliable. A young man mutters about sacrifices, about stopping the earth from tearing open. Police hear fragments, voices, earthquakes, duty. What if he truly believed the only way to save California was to kill? California sits on fault lines, used to tremors, not this. He thinks murder is prevention. To understand why, we need to go back. Before the panic, before the press conferences, there was a quiet childhood in Santa Cruz County. A Catholic family, regular Sundays, a father who carried World War II memories like shrapnel under the skin. Discipline felt like duty, thrift like virtue. On paper, it looked ordinary, but the psychology of the moment is important. Even as a child, Herbert was sensitive, rule-bound, adept at masking discomfort with obedience. Teachers noticed neat work, not nerves. He took criticism hard, lingered on small mistakes. At home, the atmosphere was controlled, respectful, sometimes rigid. In hindsight, that structure gave him a script, but not a way to process the storms that were forming beneath it. Adolescence introduced new variables. Friends saw a perfectionist, then a drifter. He experimented with marijuana, and later with hallucinogens. At the time, lots of kids did. But this was different. He grew socially withdrawn, ideas turned inward, the edges of reality turning porous. He would stare too long, fix on meanings that were not there, read intent into glances, symbols into songs. In late adolescence, the first clear breaks appeared. Intrusive thoughts slid in like static, uninvited and insistent. Paranoia crept up. Someone was signaling. Someone was testing him. He began sketching cryptic drawings, geometry mixed with theology, faces with crosshairs, maps with arrows pointing to nothing. Friends remembered a shift from anxious to unusual and unsettling. He still wanted normalcy, but it was slipping. He tried to hold on. Community college classes, odd jobs, drifting relationships that looked like anchors but never held. There were spells of focus, then stretches of emptiness. He would disappear for a day or two, come back strangely calm, speaking in riddles about purpose, about missions he could not name. Medical encounters came in fragments. A brief psychiatric admission, then release. An antipsychotic trial, short-lived. Side effects, fogginess, a sense his thoughts were being muffled. He stopped taking them. The system was not designed for long, patient engagement, and he was not inclined to ask for help he did not trust. Family urged treatment, pleaded for consistency. He said he was fine, or said nothing. What nobody knew at the time was how close he was to a new certainty. Meanwhile, California was rattled by the 1971 Silmar earthquake. Images of collapsed hospitals and crushed freeways saturated the news. For Herbert, those images were not just news. They were warnings. He started tracking tremors, collecting clippings, highlighting dates. The ground was speaking in code. He believed he could read it. The voices gained shape, not as noise but as orders. In his frame, they were not hallucinations. They were telepathic communications. Neighbors, strangers, soldiers, even the dead, all part of a network that monitored fate. The message was stark. Sacrifices prevent catastrophe. If blood was offered, the earth would hold. If not, it would break, and thousands would die. This was not fantasy to him. It was obligation. He tested the idea in small ways, looking for patterns. If he obeyed a minor instruction, did a coincidence follow? He caught himself counting, measuring silences, looking for confirmation in radio static. The world answered back because he forced it to. Ideas of reference, random events made meaningful, cemented into belief. Grandiosity crept in, dressed as patriotism. He talked about military service, about duty, about joining a larger mission. He toyed with enlistment, failed, felt humiliated. That humiliation fed the delusions. If formal service would not take him, an informal one would. He told himself he was chosen, tasked, necessary. Cannabis calmed him briefly. LSD tore open the floorboards. Each trip left residue, a sticky film of terror and revelation. Family alarm grew. They saw the restless pacing, the sudden flat stares, the muttered replies to empty rooms. They asked for help, and help arrived as a brief hold, a prescription, a referral, then discharge. Deinstitutionalization meant short stays, community care that required stability he did not have. Revolving doors are not doors at all, they are circles. And yet, for all this, Herbert still had moments of normal speech, ordinary errands, small talk with clerks who did not notice the storm behind his eyes. That is what makes this kind of dissent so hard to intercept. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. In psychiatric decline, the sentence can still sound fine, while the meaning rots underneath. This was the moment everything changed. Thought became plan. The voices stopped asking and started assigning. The rules were simple and horrifying. Find someone, make the offering, prevent the quake. He believed the math. One life now, many lives spared later. He saw himself as the dam in a rising flood. It is a terrible analogy, but it was the only one that made sense to him. And once a delusion offers purpose, it is hard to resist. The next step, he told himself, would be proof. 3 days after the Silmar quake coverage flooded the air, he clipped another article and folded it into his wallet. A hospital wing collapsed in the San Fernando Valley, the anchor said. But what Herbert heard was a countdown. The Earth was not just moving, it was warning. He started checking seismograph readouts printed in the paper, calling recorded hotlines late at night, memorizing magnitudes like other people memorize scores. The psychology of the moment is important. When the world feels unstable, a delusion that promises control can look like safety. But here is the twist. The voices did not stay vague. They took on rank and insignia. He believed a telepathic chain of command had singled him out. A covert network operating without radios, using thought alone. Neighbors could transmit. Veterans could transmit. The dead could transmit. He would sit on a bus bench and read permission in the way someone crossed their legs. A cough could mean proceed. A pause at a stoplight could mean stand down. Randomness bled out of his world. Everything spoke. He latched onto veterans, especially older men with that stiff-backed stillness he associated with his father's war stories. In his logic, combat gave people a permanent channel to the network. He followed a few at a distance, trying to catch the rhythm of their steps, trying to sync his breathing to theirs, convinced that alignment would open the line. When one glanced in his direction, he took it as a coded nod. When another looked away, he read it as denial of an order. What stands out now in retrospect is that he was building a rule book, and the rules were entirely internal. He began testing rituals, small sacrificial stand-ins. He would skip a meal on a day he predicted a tremor. If no quake hit, he logged a success. He would scratch a mark on a fence post and whisper a number. If the radio played a song with the same number in the title, he logged a confirmation. This is magical thinking hardened into protocol. It gave him a sense of calibration, when in fact, it was a closed loop. Cannabis took the edge off, briefly. But LSD was not a balm, it was gasoline. Trips fractured time, pulling him into what he described later as simultaneous channels. One was the street he stood on. The other was a briefing room where unseen officers evaluated him. Under acid, the telepathic orders felt tactile, like a pressure behind the eyes, a weight that eased only when he promised compliance. He talked about grandiosity without using the word, telling acquaintances he had a role to play, a role nobody else could handle. He tried to enlist again. Paperwork, a physical, a weight. He wanted a uniform to match the mission in his head. The rejection landed like an indictment. He was not healthy enough, stable enough. He walked out of the office feeling both exposed and deputized by a higher authority. If the official channels would not take him, the telepathic ones had. Humiliation fed the delusions, as if reality itself had acknowledged that only his private war could be fought. Family saw the swing. 1 week contrite, the next week superior. He would lecture about patriotism, recite statistics about quake probabilities pulled from newspapers, then insist probabilities could be bent with correct action. They begged for sustained treatment. The system allowed short holds, but the threshold for compelled care remained high. He would promise to take medication, then would not. Autonomy protected him from institutions, but it also left him unmoored. Meanwhile, he developed ideas of reference that fused patriotism with apocalypse. A flag at half-staff meant an urgent need for sacrifice. A veteran's cap in a grocery aisle signaled a test. He recorded dates in a pocket calendar, pairing each with a name he did not recognize yet, as if the calendar was choosing for him. And then there was the earthquake logic, the spine of it all. The earth had an appetite. If it was fed in small, controlled doses, it would not break the table. He started speaking of approval, a word that implies both authority and relief. Approval came when he obeyed minor commands, like changing walking routes or touching a specific telephone pole as he passed. Disapproval came as headaches, as a sense of dread, as imagined visions of freeways buckling and hospitals crushed. The approval-disapproval cycle trained him the way a metronome trains timing until the beat felt inevitable. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, not because we cannot see the steps, but because the gap between thought and action is so thin here. He believed sacrifices worked. He believed veterans, and sometimes strangers on a bus, had told him so. He believed California's survival rested on his compliance. Thought became plan in a new way, no longer general, but targeted. He began scouting. He watched foot traffic, memorized patterns, looked for people who, in his mind, had volunteered by giving a sign only he could see. He carried that calendar everywhere. On some pages, he drew small triangles, a private symbol for authorized. He kept clippings in a folded envelope, the Silmar images dog-eared from handling. He was not improvising anymore. He was scheduling. The delusion had matured into a mission with milestones, and each unchecked box increased the pressure. He told himself he was standing between California and ruin. He told himself the orders were lawful, because they came from everywhere. And in that cramped, echoing logic, he went looking for his first target. While that was happening in his mind, January 1972 put him on a rain-darkened stretch near Santa Cruz, walking the shoulder with his calendar in his pocket and a knife tucked under his coat. The target would not be chosen by preference, he told himself, but by authorization. A man appeared up ahead, a thin figure moving slowly, hitching a ride that was not coming. Lawrence White. Transient, middle-aged, carrying what looked like everything he owned in a small bag. In Herbert's logic, the slow turn of White's head was a signal, permission, a nod from the network. The stakes were immediate, and personal, and catastrophic. He believed a deadline had arrived. If he failed, the earth would take thousands. If he obeyed, the ground would hold. That was the math he carried as he closed the distance, boots crunching gravel, the hiss of passing cars masking approach. White stepped toward the guardrail, maybe to give space, maybe to ask for help. The psychology of the moment is important. Herbert read the movement as acquiescence. Action comes fast in these scenes because hesitation threatens the ritual. He spoke first, a question no one recorded exactly, something about directions or help. Then the blade, a short, sharp knife, came out in a single practiced motion. One thrust to the chest, angled up, the kind of stroke that seeks the heart. White staggered, hands up in reflex, not defense, surprise overriding resistance. Another thrust followed, close to the first, a tight grouping that forensic analysts later described as deliberate rather than frenzied. Minimal staging, almost none. He did not pose the body, did not search the bag. He did not take souvenirs. He wiped the knife on his sleeve, or maybe not at all, and backed away. Traffic continued, indifferent. The scene held details investigators would note later. The entry wounds were clean, the blade likely 3 to 4 inches, single-edged. Blood spatter was contained, suggesting close contact, minimal struggle. Footwear impressions were shallow, the gravel not ideal for casts. He fled, but not in panic. He crossed the highway at a lull, moved through brush, and emerged blocks away, where he could walk like any other man heading nowhere. He felt, as he later told evaluators, a release of pressure, approval. The headache that had pressed behind his eyes eased. He listened for the tremor he expected, and heard only the ordinary hum of a city that had not noticed what had just happened on its margins. From his perspective, the test had been administered, and he had passed. He believed he had broadcast compliance to the network, that veterans in kitchens and strangers on buses would register the signal. He waited for aftershocks that did not come, and read their absence as confirmation. The ritual works, one life for many. This was how he framed the act: calculated, necessary, sanctioned. Investigators' early read was narrower. A transient found dead near the road. No robbery, no obvious motive. In the 1970s, a homicide like this, without witnesses, without clear ties, sat low on solvability. Detectives canvassed a handful of businesses, took a few statements about a man seen walking, a car slowing, nothing that stuck. They logged the wounds, compared them to open cases. No match. The file took a place in a stack. Impact rippled in two directions. For law enforcement, it was a quiet case with loud questions but little to answer them. For Herbert, it was internal reinforcement. The anxiety that had clawed at him softened, briefly. He took that as proof. He told himself the network had approved the offering, that tremors had been delayed, that California had been spared through his obedience. Reward strengthens behavior. Even delusions obey that law. But here is the twist. Relief fades. The pressure returns. He started to measure days again, marking triangles on the calendar, watching the news for quakes, counting the hours between reports. The absence of catastrophe became an argument for repetition. Without another sacrifice, the line would fail. He did not brag, did not confide. He simply recalibrated the schedule. Meanwhile, across town, nothing linked White's death to a mission. A few people at a shelter asked after him. The paperwork noted a name, an age, a condition of the body. He was a person erased into a line item, which is the cruelty of random violence. In Herbert's closed system, though, White was more than a target. He was a signal, a proof point. And now that the ritual had worked, Herbert decided he could systematize it, move from testing to operation, from impulse to plan. Lawrence White's death became the hinge, and the door swung open. While that first file cooled in a drawer, Herbert rewrote his rulebook. Public spaces became viable, even necessary. The network, as he imagined it, wanted visibility. Churches, living rooms, highways. The stakes widened from one life at the roadside to any life that seemed authorized. He was not hunting types, he was hunting signs. He walked into Street Mary's, late afternoon light flattening the pews, the quiet carrying its own weight. Father Henri Tomei, a priest known for calm counsel, prepared to hear confession. Herbert read the collar as a symbol, a gate between sin and absolution. In his inverted logic, that made the priest a sanctioned conduit. He knelt, murmured something about help, then stood too quickly. The blow came fast, blunt force, a violent break in sacred routine. The psychology of the moment is important. Herbert was not mocking faith. He was co-opting ritual, replacing absolution with sacrifice. In the aftermath, investigators found blood spatter on the confessional wood, patterning that suggested repeated strikes with a heavy object, likely a club or short length of lumber. No theft, no clear motive. Parishioners, stunned, offered fragments. A tall young man, a coat, eyes that did not settle. The randomness felt deliberate, which is a paradox you hear in these rooms. It was not personal, but it was targeted, because his delusion had assigned the role. But here is the twist. He pivoted from sacred space to domestic space with chilling ease. He knew Jim Gianera from the local scene, drugs, acquaintances, loose ties. He had drawn a triangle by Gianera's name in his calendar, the private mark for authorized. Arriving under a pretext, he moved through the doorway with a plan that felt to him like procedure. Inside, he encountered Gianera, and later, through a connected thread of addresses, Kathy Francis, a young mother who was not part of any imagined network. The method shifted. Execution-style shootings, close-range control. Ballistics later linked 22 to those scenes, tight clusters that suggested calm aim rather than panic. Forensic evidence told its own story, stippling on skin from shots fired at short distance, shell casings recovered near doorways, no ransacking. He did not linger. He did not stage. He exited with the same unnerving calm that marked the highway. Investigators saw slices of a pattern, competent, contained violence across different environments. But the leap from priest to acquaintances to a bystander made linkage fragile. Without motive, detection becomes guesswork. Meanwhile, he worked the roads again, scanning for hitchhikers. Mary Guilfoyle accepted a ride because Santa Cruz in that era still pretended to be safe for rides with strangers. She was young, moving between obligations, the kind of person who had been told more often to be kind than to be cautious. Herbert offered reassurance, destination, a reasonable tone, then diverted to a quieter stretch. The attack blended stabbing with post-mortem dismemberment, a controlled calm that read as ritual. He cut carefully, collected himself, and hid what he had done in brush and ravine. It was not frenzy, it was procedure. Forensic teams, when they finally reached those sites, catalogued knife work with clinical language, incised wounds, clean separations, minimal hesitation marks. Trophy-like details appeared, small, retained items, not always consistent, but suggestive of a mind that wanted to mark success. The pattern of blunt force trauma, in one scene, stabbing in another, gunfire in a third, complicated profiling. Some killers fixate on one method. Herbert adapted, because his focus was not the method, it was the mission. Psychologically, his victim choices read like symbols, a confessor, standing at the threshold of sin and forgiveness, hippies and acquaintances, avatars of a generation he thought needed disciplining, drifters and hitchhikers, people whose disappearance produced less immediate scrutiny. In his delusion, each was authorized, but the authorization came from incidental gestures. An open door, a nod, a smile, folded into the network's imagined code. He moved with the certainty of someone who believed refusal would doom a city. Impact rippled through Santa Cruz as separate shocks. A priest dead in a church, young people missing or found murdered with no robbery, no sexual assault that could be definitively proven, no known enemy. Police struggled to link scenes without an obvious thread. Task lists grew, tips collided, then fizzled, and in the background, another killer, Edmund Kemper, was stalking co-eds, mixing messages, and muddying timelines. Randomness, multiplied, looks like chaos. Unknown to them, across town, Herbert was refining. He moved outdoors more, toward wooded edges where concealment was easier, and the quiet felt like approval. He listened for telepathic green lights, settled his breath, and stepped into encounters with that same flat calm. He thought he was saving lives, that each act prevented cracked freeways and collapsed roofs. He thought the network watched, and nodded, and waited for the next compliance. This was the moment everything changed, because escalation had become a system. Public spaces were not safe because they were public. They were attractive because they carried meaning. Confessional booths and living rooms, highways and side roads, each turned into a stage where ritual could be performed quickly and without sentimental friction. The city tried to resume its rhythm. He kept time with a different metronome, and the beat, in his mind, demanded the woods next. 3 days earlier, something strange had occurred in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Families pulled into trailheads with Coleman stoves and canvas tents, the air cold enough to make the first breath sting. Normal life, translated to redwood shade. Kids kicking pine cones, parents sorting gear, the crackle of a radio faded by trees. Meanwhile, Herbert moved along service roads and fire trails, listening for approval. The psychology of the moment is important. Wilderness offered both concealment and a kind of ceremonial purity. If the network wanted proof, the woods would witness it. The stakes rose in a way even he understood. Wilderness means thin response times. Out here, a scream can be swallowed by distance. He believed families, especially intact ones, signaled volunteer by their presence itself, a grotesque twist on domestic peace. He told himself that unity amplified sacrifice, that one act in the trees might equal 5 on a city block. When he said volunteer later, he meant the nod he imagined, the telepathic consent granted by a glance, or by nothing at all. He watched a small campsite settle. Robert, Joan, and their son David. A station wagon pulled tight to the clearing, tent stakes tapping into damp earth. He stayed on the periphery, counting his breath, measuring the pace of conversation. He told himself he would leave if denied. Then, in his reading, came permission. A turn of a head, a pause at the cooler, the kind of ordinary motion that does not carry meaning for anyone else. He stepped in. Action here turns clinical because the details are clinical. He carried a .22 rifle, stock worn smooth, sight adjusted for short range. He emerged from cover and closed the distance quickly so commands would be unnecessary, so ritual would not fracture into negotiation. Shots came tight and controlled. A round to the torso of the father first, sent a mass, the shot placement suggesting he had practiced, or at least rehearsed in his mind. The mother turned, a second shot, then a third when she did not fall immediately. The boy froze, a reflex that buys time in every other situation but this one. Another round followed, no shouted threats, no robbery. It was the ritual, stripped down. Forensic detail would later confirm what the bodies already suggested. Ballistics tied the rifle to prior scenes, land and groove impressions on recovered bullets, consistent with the same, 22. Trajectory analysis indicated close-range control, downward angles near the tent mouth, powder tattooing on clothing that meant the muzzle sat within a few feet. Spent casings clustered near a tree line, marking his firing position, the pattern showing minimal movement between shots. He had chosen a spot, anchored, executed. He did not ransack. He did not light a fire. He did not cut himself on the brambles on the way out because he had already mapped the exit. Investigators later found a faint boot print leading to a service road, tread consistent with common work boots, nothing distinctive enough to narrow by brand. There was no staging, no signature flourish. The calm felt manufactured, and it was. He had practiced emotional stillness the way other people practice a task, through repetition and reward. The psychology is corrosive. He labeled families volunteers to deflect blame, to translate horror into duty. It is the same move that turned a confessional into a sanction, that turned a hitchhiker's acceptance into consent. In his head, the network had upgraded the request. A family for a fault line. You can hear the arithmetic, 3 for thousands, cold, transactional, insane, yet internally coherent. He left the site believing he had put a thumb on the scale of fate. Community fear metastasized. News trickled down the mountains into kitchens, parks thinned out, schools adjusted field trips, parents rewrote rules for weekends, radio hosts talked about safety like it was a scarce resource, and listeners called in to measure their anxiety against the next person's. Rumor explodes in these moments. And it did. Cults in the forest, sheriffs sitting on secrets, hunters reporting flashes of movement that might be anything at all. Meanwhile, Santa Cruz was absorbing multiple blows. Edmund Kemper's spree created a separate, brutal logic, and headlines did not always separate the crimes cleanly. Press branded the place with a phrase that stuck, the murder capital. It was a headline economy, but it captured the feeling. The edges between cases blurred. Was the priest connected to the campers? Were the co-eds connected to the hitchhiker? Inter-agency meetings multiplied, tips collided, and yet the woods remained stubbornly wide. Detectives walked grid patterns, flagged cartridge cases, photographed shoe impressions that dissolved when the next rain came. The emptiness of the forest, beautiful in daylight, felt like an accomplice at night. But here is the twist. Pressure began to close in, not because of a single stroke of luck, but because repeated movement leaves residue. He was mobile, but mobility creates patterns. Routes used twice, gas stations passed at the same hour, a rifle case seen by someone who only later realized it mattered. The camping murders intensified patrols near trailheads and logging roads. Unmarked cars idled at turnouts. Rangers noted plate numbers. The system, slow and often reactive, started tracing arcs through the hills. In the aftermath, those who knew the family held small vigils, the kind that do not make the front page but tamp down the shock. A neighbor kept feeding their cat till relatives arrived. A teacher sat with empty chairs in a classroom and explained, carefully, why a classmate would not be back. Microstories like that resist erasure. They insist on the human cost. Investigators returned to the scene more than once, not because they expected the killer to come back, but because good work sometimes looks like persistence without breakthrough. What stands out now in retrospect is that the wilderness murders were not an escalation in brutality so much as an escalation in confidence. He had moved the ritual outdoors, to a place where concealment and symbolism aligned. He left feeling approved, but the woods had taken note, in brass and footprints and the quiet testimony of a campground emptied by fear. Everything was about to change when a shot in another patch of trees drew witnesses, and a license plate started a clock. While patrols crept along trailheads, a small group near the Henry Cowell Redwoods area heard what sounded like target practice, then a sharper, closer crack. Shots in the trees aren't unusual, but these came in a cluster that felt wrong, too close to the path, too controlled. 2 hikers froze, counted seconds, then moved toward the parking turnout, hearts racing, eyes scanning for motion in the brush. A neighbor who lived along the road stepped out with a notepad, a habit formed during weeks of tension, and wrote down a license plate as a compact sedan eased past at a steady, effectless speed. The stakes were immediate. He was active, mobile, and convinced he was saving lives. If not stopped, the pattern would continue. The psychology of the moment is important. His relief cycle had started to shorten, approval fading faster, pushing him to act more often. But here is the twist. The plate number, scrawled under a porch light, was clean and legible. The neighbor called it in. Dispatch flagged the make and color. Units already cruising the area received a simple instruction: if you see it, stop it. Proceed with caution. A patrol car spotted the match within miles, the sedan rolling through a four-way stop like any end-of-day driver. The traffic stop unfolded with routine choreography: lights, a chirp of the siren, a pull to the shoulder. The driver, Herbert, kept both hands on the wheel, a small, practiced calm in his posture. An officer approached on the driver's side, another on the passenger's, eyes trained for sudden movement. The first questions were simple: license, registration, where are you headed? His answers were inconsistent, even banal. He said he had been out for a drive, then mentioned the park, then corrected himself to mention a store. The sightline into the rear seat showed a rifle case. In California, that alone does not convict, but context sharpens risk. The officer asked him to step out. He did, without protest, voice flat, gaze unfixed. A quick frisk, then a request to open the trunk. He hesitated, then complied. Inside, officers noted items that mapped too closely to recent scenes: ammunition matching, .22 caliber, clothing with burrs and faint smears, a folding knife with a dark stain. They secured the weapon, read him his rights, and sat him on the curb as another unit arrived. Forensic tie-ins began at the roadside. The rifle's serial number went into the system. Ballistics would take days, but the ammunition and the casing pattern at recent scenes told a strong story. Back at the station, technicians swabbed for trace: blood proteins on the knife, fiber congruence between clothing and a blanket recovered near one of the wooded sites, soil types on boots that matched a specific trail. It was not one piece, it was a net tightening with each test. Interviews revealed the logic that had propelled him. He spoke of earthquakes unprompted, of a duty assigned telepathically, of sacrifices that kept the ground calm. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded procedural, as if reciting a checklist that any reasonable person would follow. Detectives asked about dates. He supplied them, sometimes with unsettling precision. They asked why specific people. He said they had volunteered, that they had given permission that nobody else could hear. The room went quiet in those moments because the gap between his certainty and the brutality on paper was so wide. Meanwhile, lab work turned certainty into evidence. Test fires from the seized, .22 produced ballistic markings, land and groove impressions, extractor and firing pin signatures that matched spent bullets from the camping scene, and casings recovered near a doorway in town. Blood trace on the knife, when typed, aligned with one victim's known type. Fiber analysis showed a match between yarn found on one victim's clothing and a blanket in the back seat. None of these alone would close the case, but together they created a lattice that held. Impact came quickly. The arrest removed an immediate threat from trails and side roads. Word moved through law enforcement channels first, then into the community, where fear edged into exhausted relief. The label murder capital did not vanish, but it lost a little of its grip. Investigators who had been working parallel cases compared notes, mapped times, and found the overlaps that had been obscured by the city's unique dual terror. And yet, for all this, the next terrain was not forensic, it was legal. Sanity versus responsibility, delusion versus awareness. Those questions waited in a courtroom. He sat in a cell, calm, sometimes prayerful, sometimes silent, still convinced that the plate, the stop, even the cuffs, were part of a broader authorization he had misunderstood. Court loomed, and with it, a collision between the logic in his head and the law's demand for accountability. The courtroom looked ordinary, polished benches and a low murmur before the gavel, but the questions inside it were not. Could a man who believed he was stopping earthquakes understand that murder was wrong? Or did the delusion erase criminal intent? The stakes were stark. Insanity versus responsibility, treatment versus punishment, a community's fear pressed against a legal standard that rarely bends. Prosecutors opened with method. They walked the jury through planning, movement, concealment, each decision framed as evidence of awareness. He selected locations with low visibility, approached with surprise, used a firearm at controlled range, fled efficiently, and avoided unnecessary contact. That, they argued, is not chaos. That is control. They pointed to his post-crime calm, A traffic stop without panic, a trunk with tools, a voice that did not shout. He knew what he was doing, and he knew to avoid being caught. But here is the twist. The defense did not dispute the acts. They attacked the mind that did them. Schizophrenia, they said. Command hallucinations. A fixed delusion that human sacrifice prevented catastrophe. They presented medical records showing early hospitalizations, notes of paranoia, reports of intrusive voices. Family members described the onset, withdrawal, strange drawings, muttered replies to silence. A clinician outlined a symptom timeline, ideas of reference, grandiosity, and a rigid, apocalyptic belief system that did not yield to contradiction. Psychiatrists took the stand with careful language. One explained how a delusion can feel like gravity, unseen but absolute. He described command hallucinations as orders that carry moral weight, especially when they promise protection of others. Another expert addressed capacity. A person can distinguish right from wrong in the abstract, yet believe an extraordinary exception applies. A higher duty that neutralizes ordinary morality. The psychology of the moment is important. In that narrow frame, refusal feels like mass homicide, compliance like rescue. Prosecutors pushed back. If he believed sacrifice was lawful, why not tell people beforehand? Why vary methods? Why clean the weapon, choose secluded settings, and deny specifics until evidence cornered him? They argued these were signs of a man who knew society condemned his actions, who hid because he recognized the wrongness. They emphasized coherence under questioning, dates recalled, scenes mapped, suggesting intact cognition, not incapacitating psychosis. The defense countered with context. Coherence is not sanity, it is structure. Delusions can be internally consistent, even precise. They replayed his own words. Volunteers, approval, orders. They noted his fixation on veterans as transmitters, flags as signals, earthquakes as consequence. They told the jury that motive matters, not to excuse, but to qualify mental state. If he acted under a delusional necessity, could he truly appreciate criminality in the way the law requires? Jury tension was visible, pencils stilled when families spoke, eyes down when photographs appeared. A mother described a birthday that arrived without her child. A priest's parishioner spoke about sitting in a pew that still smelled faintly of cleaner and fear. Empathy drifted toward victims, as it should. But the law asked for a narrower focus. Did psychosis annihilate responsibility, or did it merely complicate it? The judge instructed on the insanity standard, that narrow gate. At the time, the test turned on whether a defendant could understand the nature and quality of the act, or know it was wrong. The judge emphasized that delusional motive, however sincere, does not alone establish insanity if the defendant still knew society prohibited the act. Jurors took notes, their faces unreadable. In closing, the prosecution returned to planning, calendars marked, weapons chosen, exits mapped. He did not stumble into these scenes, the prosecutor said. He engineered them. The defense returned to earthquakes. He thought he was preventing mass death, counsel said. And in that grip, wrong becomes right. Two truths collided, brutal acts, disturbed mind. The verdict threaded a middle line the law often takes. Guilty on multiple counts, with distinctions between first and second degree that reflected planning versus impulsivity across scenes, not legally insane. The jury, in effect, found that his delusions did not erase his recognition that society condemned killing, even as those delusions drove him. The sentence was long, decades to serve, with placement in a state facility where psychiatric care sat alongside custody. Impact moved beyond him. The case reignited debates about mental illness and danger, about the limits of autonomy when risk turns lethal. Families asked whether earlier, sustained treatment could have interrupted the path. Clinicians argued for better continuity of care. Lawmakers heard both, then tabled most proposals until the next crisis. After the verdict, the question became meaning and memory, how to hold the human cost without simplifying the mind that caused it. While Herbert sat behind glass, Santa Cruz was still untangling a second thread. Edmund Kemper had been hunting co-eds, abductions, murder, dismemberment, operating in the same window of time, on the same roads, in the same fog of fear. Two predators, different psychologies, overlapping geography. What happens to a city when patterns collide like that? The timeline is stark. As Mullin moved between roadside assaults and quick executions, Kemper cruised campus perimeters in a hulking car, disarming with size and a gentle voice. Detectives tried to sort method from method. 22 ballistics here, abduction there, ritual language here, calculated interviews there, but scene after scene entered the system without a clean label, and pressure grew. Media saturated the air. Headlines coined the phrase, murder capital of the world, an economic choice that stuck like a stain. Radio call-ins mapped rumor, satanic cults, biker wars, secret task forces, parents redrafted curfews. Hitchhiking collapsed almost overnight. A cultural ritual turned into a risk no one could justify. Campus bulletins multiplied, ride boards, buddy systems, doors double-checked, policing bent under strain. Interagency meetings blurred jurisdictional lines, but friction showed sheriff's deputies protective of their cases, city detectives guarding informants, state labs overloaded, false leads stacked up, a similar car, a similar boot print, a man with a rifle case that was not the rifle. The investigative grid, wide by necessity, let stress leak into every conversation. What stands out in hindsight is the ambiguity ordinary people lived with. Was the priest tied to the co-eds? Were the campers tied to the hitchhiker? Residents did not pass typology. They counted the dead. Panic is not a headline. It is a routine. Streetlights that once meant safety now just marked the border of the dark. Footsteps behind you became a calculus of distance and escape. And then, almost abruptly, Kemper turned himself in. Another rupture, another narrative. The city exhaled, but only partially. The parallel darkness had done its work. People changed routes. Stores changed hours. Children learned a new vocabulary for danger. In the quiet after arrests, Santa Cruz held a long, uneasy question. Could this have been prevented, or did the system only ever arrive after the fact? To answer that, you have to look at policy. The 1960s and early 1970s pushed deinstitutionalization, closing large hospitals, promising community care that never arrived at scale. Brief holds replaced months of treatment. Paperwork replaced continuity. Families, already stretched, were told to monitor, persuade, and hope. Missed chances dotted Herbert's record. Short admissions, early discharges, medication started and stopped. Each contact ended before trust formed. Criteria for compelled treatment were strict by design: imminent danger, specific threats, a narrow legal window. He rarely fit neatly. Autonomy protected his rights. It also left him drifting, symptomatic, untreated. The ethics are hard. Guardianship can prevent harm, but it can also become a cage. Clinicians calculated risk with tools still in their infancy, while legal standards demanded precision. A person can be gravely ill without being legally detainable. Meanwhile, families carry the weight: late-night drives, crisis calls, ultimatums that feel like betrayal. Policy shifted slowly. Conservatorships expanded in some cases. 5,150 criteria debated. Pilot programs funded, then unfunded. Better outpatient teams helped some. But prevention is a chain. If any link fails, housing, medication access, case management, the system reverts to crisis response. And crisis response arrives after a line has already been crossed. The psychology of the moment is important here too. Delusions that frame violence as rescue are rare, but not unimaginable. Treatment adherence requires insight. Insight is precisely what psychosis erodes. Without sustained engagement, relapse is not a possibility. It is a schedule. In the aftermath, advocates pushed two truths at once: protect civil liberties and build real support. Not posters, not promises, clinics open past 5, beds that do not vanish at discharge, caseworkers with workable caseloads. The cost is high. The cost of not doing it is written in obituaries. Beyond policy, the memory of victims demands names, not abstractions. Programs and statutes matter, but they are not the point. The point is the people who never came home and the families still waiting for a phone that will not ring. The story narrows now. Names first, because names resist the erasure. Lawrence White stood on a shoulder of road carrying almost everything with him, but not only that. He had routines, shelter breakfasts, familiar faces at the mission, a way of rolling his spare shirt so it stayed dry if rain came. People knew him as quiet, grateful, a man who said thank you even when the coffee was thin. He did not volunteer for anything that day. He was trying to get somewhere on foot. Father Henri Tomei kept regular hours at Street Mary's, a priest with a steady voice, the kind who sat longer than scheduled if someone needed an extra 10 minutes to finish a sentence. He had told friends he liked late afternoons in the church, when the light softened and people found the nerve to confess things they had carried for years. He walked into the booth expecting to absolve, not to meet a stranger's delusion head-on. Mary Guilfoyle was moving between plans: school, a job, the small economies of being young, and trying to stretch a week's money past a week. Friends remembered her smile as easy, her kindness as reflex. She took a ride because that was still normal then, a way to close the distance between where you were and where you had to be, trusting that the gap would be safe. Jim Gennaro had a circle, acquaintances, music, loose threads of a counterculture that made Santa Cruz feel communal. He was not a symbol. He was a person with errands and a front door he opened because people came and went in that scene. Kathy Francis, drawn into the chain by proximity and bad timing, was a young mother making a home. There are details we do not need to repeat to know what was taken from her children when the door opened that day. In the mountains, Robert and Joan camped with their son David, doing the simple math of rest, one weekend of trees to reset a week of obligations, radios on low, a stove that took too long to catch, a boy counting stars he could actually see. Their absence echoed through places that do not make headlines. A classroom with a desk that stayed empty, a neighbor who kept collecting mail because the habit was hard to break, even when you knew. Families learned the new rituals of grief, choosing photographs for services, answering phones that rang for the wrong reasons, marking birthdays because skipping them felt like letting go too soon. Anniversaries became heavy. Some turned to advocacy, speaking about treatment gaps, testifying about risk, naming the people they loved so hearings would not dissolve into policy speak. Others stayed quiet, protecting what little privacy grief allows. Micro-stories hold the truth better than statistics. A parishioner who still sits in the same pew out of loyalty. A shelter volunteer who keeps an extra coat by the door in case someone asks for it the way Lawrence once did. A teacher who folds attendance sheets more carefully now. These are the places where violence resists abstraction. They were not volunteers. They did not consent through a nod or a pause or a glance. They were people moving through ordinary days, interrupted by someone else's private war. Saying their names is not closure. It is the minimum. With memory restored, we can end the narrative without letting it end them.